Hello. Hello, hello. Happy Tuesday. How's it going? Hey, Noodles. Good to see you. Good evening. Hello, hello. Hey, Falcor. How's it going? I feel like today is just one of those days where it's like, holy shit, it's 4 o'clock. What have I been doing all day? uh, and I don't know if I could tell you. It's just one of those days. I was busy all day, and yet here we are. You finished The Hobbit. Amazing. Amazing. I watched a little bit of the VOD this morning, but I didn't know you finished it. So now I'll have to go back and rewatch, or at least watch to where I left off. You're barely out of bed. Excellent. Hey, Wadsworth. Hello. Hello. Ooh, nice. Went with the more ASMR feel. Very good, very good. Wadsworth, thank you so much for contributing to April's Sunday stream. We are 74% in. Amazing. And so early, too. I feel like usually we're not that high this early. You think somebody insulted you on stream? I like that it's like, maybe? Yeah. That's true. February was a little pressed for time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm not streaming on like earlier in the month, so that also helps. I feel like, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like half of as many days. Oh my gosh, have you heard the like which month is it that has 28 days? All of them. They all have 28 days. Uh, I remember being asked that question and just like, I don't know. Oh, yeah, people are mean. Sorry, Noodles. Yeah, so reading update, I guess. I guess we'll do that. I am so close to finishing Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I'm going to be finishing it on Friday during sprints, but I have like 50 pages left. So that's very exciting. So I will be finishing. It's okay. It's okay. I mean, like I am enjoying it. I shouldn't say that it's just okay. I am enjoying it. I am liking it. However, it's just not gonna be like my favorite genre ever. It's just really nice to take a breather from like the more like dark, depressing things that I'm used to reading. Um, so yes, you have to run and grab something for yes, yes, yes. Enjoy. Don't rush. Take your time. Do what you gotta do. Yes, yes. We'll see you soon. So yes, I'm going to be finishing this on Friday, and then also on Friday I will be starting Born Standing Up by Steve Martin. So I'm excited for that. A Comic's Life. Thank you, Wadsworth, for your suggestion for this one. Excited to read it. And then off stream, I have been reading Chance by Matthew Fitzsimmons. It is a science fiction book. It like just came out this year. I'm pretty sure I'm the first person to check this out and read it from the library because like it's it it smells new, but also like the binding isn't broken and like it was a little like I don't know, like a little not as easy to just flop over. So he's done. He's done with rock, paper, scissors. So I have like 60, oh my gosh, pages left in this one. Shona, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hello. I have like 60 pages left in this book. It is about It takes place in the future in like 2046 or something like that. And there is cloning, and cloning is pretty much reserved for the super wealthy, just because it is expensive. And so when somebody dies, they can be like their consciousness, which has been uploaded, can be put into a clone of their body. Uh, and it follows this one guy named Chance who, when he was younger, he was kidnapped along with his brother, and his kidnappers killed him. So he's one of the first people to have been cloned, and his dad was involved in the process. So like he has pretty much unlimited clones, and he has a lot of lag in his memory because he didn't upload like as frequently then. So he doesn't remember anything about his kidnappers, anything about the situation, nothing like that. And it's been a while. It's been like 10 years since then, 8 years, something like that. But because of that, and because of the like unlimited clones, his life basically is doing like a lot of daredevil stunts, but knowing that each of them will end in his death for the views, for the social media content, like that sort of thing. And one of the times that he is revived, he doesn't know what happened in the last 18 hours, and the police come and arrest him for the murder of somebody that he has never heard of. He doesn't know who this person is. He doesn't know what this person looks like. Nothing. Okay, cool, right, Toner. That's gonna get you a ban. Excellent. Not that type of stream. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Um, and yeah, so he doesn't know anything about this person, and so he's trying to figure out who this person is, why he did it, because he's so vigilant with like keeping up to date so he doesn't have lags in his memory. So he films everything. And yeah, it's good. And the police don't really care like the why or anything like that. And there's like this whole like uprising because there's this group that I forgot what they're called, but it's something about like Adam, like children of Adam, and they're very against cloning, and they're not seen as people, they're seen as things, like that sort of thing. So lots of commentary, which is why sci-fi is so great because it's an escape, but at the same time there's a lot of like commentary about things that are currently going on. So I'm curious to see. It seems like the closer I get, I would have answers, but I just have more questions. So we'll see. But this is, I think, just like a one-off book. I don't think that this is a series, and I'm really hoping that it's not, because this was just like an impulse grab. Like I was at the library for something else and just saw this, and I was like, I need it. So we'll see. But today we are reading Storm Over Warlock. Yes, I do recommend it so far. The writing isn't the best, but the story itself is good. Like, that's what's keeping me going. It's not like the best thing that I've ever read before, but it is an interesting concept and something that I have not read before, which is cool. It's not like a retelling or borrowing heavily from other things, which is nice. It's a it's a good refresh for the genre, I think. So, yes. Today we will be reading, continuing on in Storm Over Warlock. We are starting with chapter 6 today. So this is just the second day of reading. So if you're just hopping in for and didn't get the last one, don't worry, you didn't miss all that much. What you did miss was we have a group of Terrans from the planet Terra, which is very similar to Earth. And they are searching different planets to see if they are habitable because their resources are running low. And when they're doing this, they are running into an alien race on several different instances called Thrugs, Trugs, something like that. We'll come up to it and then I'll be like, that's what it was called. And the alien race is very colonizational. So they're very much into conquering and Throgs. Yes, you're totally right, Falcor. Thank you. They're very much into conquering and depleting and like just completely taking over. And so we have our main character, Shan, who wakes up and he is well, I guess he didn't wake up. He was just in another part of the planet. But he because you thought I said frogs. That's a good memory. He was on a different part of the planet, and as he's coming back to his camp, he has seen that all of the Throgs have killed the rest of his crew. So he is the only survivor. Him and two, oh my gosh, Wolverines. Yeah, him and two Wolverines, uh, trying to survive. But then they do find another crew member who is ranked higher than he is. Shan has self-proclaimed himself to be the most useless person on the crew, and yeah. He's like, I don't know how to do any of these things. I don't know how I'm going to survive. It's a good thing that this other person came along because they are very resourceful. And so they are convincing the Throgs that there are like native populations on this planet by like attacking them and building up these camp structures. So we don't know what the end game is yet, but we'll see. And they have just done an attack and they are running away from the Throgs, and the Hound has been released. And we haven't seen what the Hound can do or what it looks like or anything like that, but they're just floating down the river with their Wolverines right now, trying to get to like far away, a safer spot. So that's where we are. Let's do it. Hold on. I need a sip. I need a sip first. So get cozy, and here we go. Chapter 6. The Hound. The sun was a harsh ball of heat, baking the ground, and then, in some odd manner, drawing back the same fieriness. In the coolness of the eastern mountains, Shan would not have believed that Warlock could hold such heat. The men discarded their jackets early as they swung to dip the poles, but they dared not strip off the rest of their clothing lest their skin burn. And again gusts of wind now drove sand over the edge of the cut to blanket the water. Shan wiped his eyes, pausing in his eternal push-push to look at the rocks which they were passing in threatening proximity. For the slash which held the river had narrowed, and the rock of its walls was naked of earth, save for sheltered pockets holding the drift of sand dust, while boulders of all sizes cut into the path of the flowing water. He had not been mistaken. They were going faster. Faster even than their efforts with the poles would account for. With the narrowing of the bed of the stream, the current was taking on a new swiftness. Shan said as much, and Thorvald nodded. Thorvald is the person that he found alive from the crew. We're approaching the first of the rapids. Where we can get off and look around, Shan croaked wearily. The dust gritted behind his teeth, irritated his eyes. Do we stay beside the river? As long as we can, Thorvald replied somberly. We have no way of transporting water. Yes, a man could live on very slim rations of food, continue to beat his way over a bad trail if he had the concentrate tablets they carried. But there was no going without water, and in this heat such an effort would finish them quickly. Always they both listened for another cry from behind, a cry to tell them just how near the Throg hunting party had come. No Throg flyers yet, Shan observed. He had expected one of those black plates to come cruising the moment the Hound had pointed the direction of their pursuers. Not in a storm such as this. Thorvald, without releasing his hold on the raft pole, pointed with his chin to the swirling haze cloaking the air above the cut walls. Here the river dug yet deeper into the beginning of a canyon. They could breathe better. The dust still sifted down, but not as thickly as a half-hour earlier. Though, over their heads, the sky was now a grayish lid, shutting out the sun, bringing a portion of coolness to the travelers. The survey officer glanced from side to side, watching the banks as if hunting for some special mark or sign. At last, he used his pole as a pointer to indicate a rough pile of boulders ahead. Some from former landslide had dammed the river at that point, and the drift of seasonal floods was caught in and among the rocky pile to form a prickly peninsula. In there, they brought the raft to shore, fighting the faster current. The wolverines, who had been subdued by the heat and the dust, flung themselves to the rocks with the eagerness of passengers deserting a sinking ship for certain rescue. Thorvald settled the map case more securely between his arm and side before he took the same leap. When they were all ashore, he prodded the raft out into the stream again, pushing the platform along until it was sucked by the current past the line of boulders. Listen! But Shan had already caught that distant rumble of sound. It was steady, beating like some giant drum. Certainly it did not herald a Throg ship in flight, and it came from ahead, not from their back trail. Rapids. Perhaps even the falls. Thorvald interpreted that faint thunder. Now, let's see what kind of road we can find here. The tongue of boulders, spiked with driftwood, was firmly based against the wall of the cut, but it sloped up to within a few feet of the top of that gap, more than one landslide having contributed to its fashioning. The landing stage paralleled the river for perhaps some 50 feet. Beyond it, water splashed a straight wall. They would have to climb and follow the stream along the top of the embankment, maybe being forced well away from the source of the water. By unspoken consent, they both knelt and drank deeply from their cupped hands, splashing more of the liquid over their heads, washing the dust from their skins. Then they began to climb the rough ascent up which the wolverines had already vanished. The murk above them was less solid, but again the fine grit streaked their faces, embedding itself in their hair. Shan paused to scrape a film of mud from his lips and chin. Then he made the last pull, bracing his slight body against the push of the wind he met there. A palm struck hard between his shoulders, nearly sending him sprawling. He had only wits enough left to recognize that as in order to get on, and he staggered ahead until rock arched over him and the sand drift was shut off. His shoulder met solid stone, and having rubbed the sand from his eyes, Shan realized he was in a pocket in the cliff walls. Well overhead, he caught a glimpse of natural amber sky through a slit, but here was a twilight which thickened into complete darkness. There was no sign of wolverines. Thorvald moved along the pocket southward, and Shan followed him. Once more they faced a dead end. For the crevice, with the sheer descent to the river on the right, the cliff wall at its back, came to an abrupt stop in a drop which caught at Shan's stomach when he ventured to look down. If some battleship of the interstellar fleet had aimed a force beam across the mountains of Warlock, cutting down to what lay under the first envelope of planet skin, perhaps the resulting wound might have resembled that slash. What had caused such a break between the height on which they stood and the much taller peak beyond, Shan could not guess. But it must have been a cataclysm of spectacular dimensions. There was certainly no descending to the bottom of that cut and reclimbing the rock face on the other side. The fugitives would either have to return to the river with all its ominous warnings of trouble to come, or find some other path across that gap which now provided such an effective barrier to the west. Down! Just as Thorvald had pushed him out of the murk of the dust storm into the crevice, so now did that officer jerk Shan from his feet, forcing him to the floor of the half-cave from which they had partially emerged. A shadow moved across the bright band of sunlit sky. Back! Thorvald caught at Shan again, his greater strength prevailing as he literally dragged the younger man into the dusk of the crevice. And he did not pause, nor allow Shan to do so, even when they were well under cover again. At last they reached the dark hole in the southern wall which they had passed earlier, and a push from Thorvald sent his companion into that. Then a blow greater than any the survey officer had aimed at him struck Shan. He was hurled against a rough wall with impetus enough to explode the air in his lungs, the ensuing pain so great that he feared his ribs had given under that thrust. Before his eyes, fire lashed down the slit, searing him into temporary blindness. That flash was the last thing he remembered as thick darkness closed in, shutting him into the nothingness of unconsciousness. It hurt to breathe. He was slowly aware first of that pain, and then the fact that he was breathing, that he had to endure the pain for the sake of breath. His whole body was jarred into a dull torment as a weight pressed upon his twisted legs. Then strong animal breath puffed into his face. Shan lifted one hand by willpower, touched thick fur, felt the rasp of a tongue laid wetly across his fingers. Something close to terror engulfed him for a second or two when he knew that he could not see. The black about him was colored with jagged flashes of red, which he somehow guessed were actually inside his eyes. He groped through that fire-pierced darkness. An animal whimpered from the throat of the shaggy body pressed against him. He answered that movement. Taggy? The shove against him was almost enough to pin him once more to the wall, a painful crush on his aching ribs as the wolverine responded to his name. That second nudge from the other side must be Togi's bid for attention. But what had happened? Thorvald had hurled him back just after the shadow had swung over the ledge. That shadow! Shan's wit quickened as he tried to make sense of what he could remember. A Throg ship. Then that fiery lash which had cut after them could only have resulted from one of those energy bolts, such as had wiped out the others of his kind at the camp. But he was still alive. Thorvald? He called through his personal darkness. When there was no answer, Shan called again, more urgently. Then he hunched forward on his hands and knees, pushing Taggy gently aside, running his hands over projecting rocks, uneven flooring. His fingers touched what could only be cloth before they met the warmth of flesh, and he half threw himself against the supine body of the survey officer, groping awkwardly for heartbeat, for some sign that the other was still living. What? The one word came thickly, but Shan gave something close to a sob of relief as he caught the faint mutter. He squatted back on his heels, pressed his forearm against his aching eyes in a kind of fierce will to see. Perhaps that pressure did relieve some of the blackout, for when he blinked again, the complete dark and fiery trails had faded to gray, and he was sure he saw dimly a source of light to his left. The Throg ship had fired upon them, but the aliens could not have used the full force of their weapon, or neither of the Terrans would still be alive, which meant, Shan's thought began to make sense which brought apprehension. The Throgs probably intended to disable rather than kill. They wanted prisoners, just as Thorvald had warned. How long did the Terrans have before the aliens would come to collect them? There was no fit landing place hereabouts for their flyer. The beetles would have to set down at the edge of the desert land and climb the mountains on foot. Beetles are referring to the Throgs because of their body composition. They look like beetles. And the Throgs were not good at that. So, the fugitives still had a measure of time. Time to do what? The country itself held them securely captive. That drop to the southwest was one barrier. To retreat eastward would mean running straight into the hands of the hunters. To descend again to the river, their raft gone, was worse than useless. There was only this side pocket in which they sheltered. The And once the Throgs arrived, they could scoop the Terrans out at their leisure, perhaps while stunned by a controlling energy beam. Taggy? Togi? Shan was suddenly aware that he had not heard the Wolverines for some time. He was answered by a weirdly muffled call. From the south. Had the animals found a new exit? Was this niche more than just a niche? A cave of some length, or even a passage running back into the interior of the peaks? With that faint hope spurring him, Shan bent again over Thorvald, able now to make out the other's huddled form. Then he drew the torch from the inner loop of his coat and pressed the lowest stud. His eyes smarted in answer to that light, watered until tears patterned the grime and dust on his cheeks. But he could make out what lay before them, a hole leading into the cliff face, the hole which might furnish the door to escape. The survey officer moved, levering himself up, his eyes screwed tightly shut. Lanty? That's Shan's last name. Here, and there's a tunnel right behind you. The Wolverines went that way. To his surprise, there was a thin ghost of a smile on Thorvald's usually straight-lipped mouth. And we'd better be away before visitors arrive? So he, too, must have thought his way through the sequence of past action to the same conclusion concerning the Throg movements. Can you see, Lanty? The question was painfully casual, but a note in it, almost reaching for reassurance, cut for the first time through the wall which had stood between them from their chance meeting by the wrecked ship. Better now. I couldn't when I first came to, Shan answered quickly. Thorvald opened his eyes, but Shan guessed that he was as blind as he himself had been. He caught at the officer's nearer hand, drawing it to rest on his own belt. Grab hold. Shan was giving the orders now. By the look of that opening, we had better try crawling. I have a torch on at low. Good enough. The other's fingers fumbled on the band about Shan's slim waist until they gripped tight at his back. He started on into the opening, drawing Thorvald by that hold with him. Luckily, they did not have to crawl far, for shortly past the entrance, the fault or vein they were following became a passage high enough for even the tall Thorvald to travel without stooping. And then only a little later he released his hold on Shan, reporting he could now see well enough to manage his own. The torch beam caught on a wall and awoke from there a glitter, which hurt their eyes, a green-gold cluster of crystals. Several feet on, there was another flash of embedded crystals. Those might promise priceless wealth, but neither Terran paused to examine them more closely or touch their surfaces. From time to time, Shan whistled. And always he was answered by the Wolverines, their calls coming from ahead. So the men continued to hope that they were not walking into a trap from which the Throgs could extract them. Snap off your torch a moment, Thorvald ordered. Shan obeyed. The subdued light vanished. Yet there was still light to be seen, ahead and above. Front door, Thorvald observed. How do we get up? The torch showed them that, a narrow ladder of ledges branching off when the passage they followed took a turn to the left and east. Afterward, Shan remembered that climb, with wonder that they had actually made it, though their advance had been slow, passing the torch from one to another to make sure of their footing. Shan was top man when at last spurt of effort enabled him to draw himself out into the open, his hands raw, his nails broken and torn. He sat there, stupefied with his own weariness, to stare about. Thorvald called impatiently, and Shan reached for the torch to hold it for the officer. Then Thorvald crawled out. He, too, looked around in dull surprise. On either side, peaks cut high into the amber of the sky, but this bowl in which the man had found refuge was rich in growing things. Though the trees were stunted, the grass grew almost as high here as it did on the meadows of the lowlands. Quartering the pocket valley, galloped the Wolverines, expressing in that wild activity their delight in this freedom. Good campsite. Thorvald shook his head. We can't stay here. And to underline that gloomy prophecy, There issued from that hole through which they had just come, muffled and broken, but still threatening, the howl of the Throg's hound. The survey officer caught the torch from Shan's hold and knelt to flash it into the interior of the passage. As the beam slowly circled that opening, he held out his other arm, measuring the size of the aperture. "When that thing gets on a hot scent," he snapped off the beam, "the beetles won't be able to control it. There will be no reason for them to attempt to. Those hounds obey their first orders: kill or capture. And I think this one operates on capture, so they'll loose it to run ahead of their party." "And we move to knock it out?" Shan replied, now on the other's experience. Thorvald rose. "It would need a blaster on full power to finish off a hound. No, we can't kill it, but we can make it a doorkeeper to our advantage." He trotted down into the valley, Shan beside him, without understanding in the least, but aware that Thorvald did have some plan. The officer bent, searched the ground, and began to pull from under the loose surface dirt one of those nets of tough vines which they had used for cords. He thrust a double handful of this hasty harvest into Shan's hold with a single curt order: "Twist these together and make as thick a rope as you can." Shan twisted, discovering to his pleased surprise that under pressure the vines exuded a sticky purple sap, which not only coated his hands, but also acted as an adhesive for the vines themselves, so that his task was not nearly as formidable as it had first seemed. With his force axe, Thorvald cut down 2 of the stunted trees and stripped them of branches, wedging the poles into the rocks about the entrance of the hole. They were working against time, but on Thorvald's part with practiced efficiency. Twice more that cry of the hunter arose from the depths behind them, as the westering sun, almost down now, shone into the valley hollow. Thorvald set up the frame of his trap. "We can't knock it out any more than we can knock out a Throg, but a beam from a stunner ought to slow it up long enough for this to work." Taggy burst out of the grass, approaching the hole with purpose, and Togi was right on his heels. Both of them stared into that opening, drooling a little, the same eagerness in their pose as they had displayed when hunting. Shan remembered how that first howl of the Throg hound had drawn both animals to the edge of the occupied camp in spite of their marked distaste for its alien masters. "They're after it, too," he told Thorvald what he had noted on the night of their sortie. "Maybe they can keep it occupied," the other commented, "but we don't want them to actually mix with it. That might be fatal." A clamor broke out in the interior passage. Taggy snarled, backing away a few steps before he uttered his own war cry. "Ready!" Thorvald jumped to the net slung from the poles. Shan raised his stunner. Togi underlined her mate's challenge with a series of snarls rising in volume. There was a tearing, scrambling sound from within. Then Shan fired at the jack-in-the-box appearance of a monstrous head, and Thorvald released the deadfall. The thing squalled. Ropes beat, growing taut. The wolverines backed from jaws, which snapped fruitlessly. To Shan's relief, the Terran animals appeared content to bait the now imprisoned, or collared, horror, without venturing to make any close attack. But he reckoned that too soon. Perhaps the stunner had slowed up the hound's reflexes, for those jaws stilled with the last shattering snap. The toad lizard mask, a head which was against all nature as the Terrans knew it, was quiet in the strangle leash of the rope, the rest of the body serving as a cork to fill the exit hole. Taggy had been waiting only for such a chance. He sprang, claws ready, and Togi went in after her mate to share the battle. End of chapter 6. Falcors, thank you so much for contributing to Sunday's stream. All right. Chapter 7. Unwelcome Guide. There was a small eruption of earth and stone as the hound came alive, fighting to reach its tormentors. The resulting din was deafening. Shan, avoiding by a hand's breadth a snap of jaws with power to crush his legs into bone powder and mangled flesh, cuffed Togi across her nose and buried his hands in the fur about Taggy's throat as he heaved the male wolverine back from the struggling monster. He shouted orders, and to his surprise Togi did obey, leaving him free to yank Taggy away. Perhaps neither wolverine had expected the full fury of the hound. Though he suffered a slash across the back of one hand, delivered by the overexcited Taggy. In the end, Shan was able to get both animals away from the hole, now corked so effectively by the slavering thing. Thorvald was actually laughing as he watched his younger companion in action. This ought to slow up the beetles. If they haul their little doggy back, it's apt to take out some of its rage on them, and I'd like to see them dig around it. Oh my gosh, don't worry, Falcor. Considering that the monstrous head was swinging from side to side in a collar of what seemed to be immovable rocks, Shan thought Thorvald right. He went down on his knees beside the wolverines, soothing them with hand and voice, trying to get them to obey his orders willingly. Ha! Thorvald brought his mud-stained hands together with a clap, the sharp sound attracting the attention of both animals. Shan scrambled up, swung out his bleeding hand in the simple motion which meant to hunt, being careful to signal down the valley westward. Taggy gave a last reluctant growl at the hound, to be answered by one of its ear-torturing howls, and then trotted off, Togi tagging behind. Thorvald caught Shan's slashed hand, inspecting the bleeding cut. From the aid packet at his belt, he brought out powder and a strip of protecting plastiflesh to cleanse and bind the wound. "You'll do," he commented, "but we'd better get out of here before full dark." The small paradise of the valley was no safe campsite. It could not be so long as that monstrosity on the hillside behind them roared and howled its rage to the darkening sky. Trailing the wolverines, the men caught up with the animals drinking from a small spring and thankfully shared that water. Then they pushed on, not able to forget that somewhere in the peaks about must lurk the Throg flyer ready to attack on sight. Only darkness could not be held off by the will of men. Here in the open there was no chance to use the torch. As long as they were within the valley boundaries, the phosphorescent bushes marked the path. But by the coming of complete darkness, they were once more out in a region of bare rock. The wolverines had killed a brace of skitterers, consuming hide and soft bones as well as the meager flesh, which was not enough to satisfy their hunger. However, to Shan's relief, they did not wander too far ahead, and as the men stopped at last on a ledge where a fall of rock gave them some limited shelter, both animals crowded in against the humans, adding the heat of their bodies to the slight comfort of that camped resting place. From time to time, Shan was startled out of a troubled half-sleep by the howl of the hound. Luckily, that sound never seemed any louder. If the Throgs had caught up with their hunter, and certainly they must have done so by now, they either could not or would not free it from the trap. Shan dozed again, untroubled by any dreams, to awake hearing the shrieks of clack-clacks. But when he studied the sky, he was able to sight none of the cliff-dwelling Warlockian bats. "More likely they are paying attention to our friend back in the valley," Thorvald said dryly, rightly reading Shan's glance to the clouds overhead. "Ought to keep them busy." Clack-clacks were meat-eaters, only they preferred their chosen prey weak and easy to attack. The imprisoned hound would certainly attract their kind, and those shrill cries now bellying through the mountain heights ought to draw every one of their species within miles. "There it is." Thorvald, pulling himself to his feet by a rock handhold, gazed westward, his gaunt face eager. Shan, expecting no less than a cruising Throg ship, searched for cover on their perch. Perhaps if they flattened themselves behind the fall of stones, they might be able to escape attention. Yet Thorvald made no move into hiding, and so Shan followed the line of the other's fixed stare. Before and below them lay a maze of heights and valleys, sharp drops, and saw-toothed rises, but on the far rim of that section a badlands shone the green of the Warlockian sea rippling on to the only dimly seen horizon. They were now within sight of their goal. Welcome back, Noodles. Had they had one of the exploration sky flitters from the overrun camp, they could have walked its beach sands within the hour. Instead, they fought their way through a devil-designed country for the next 2 days. Twice, they had narrow escapes from the Throg ship, or ships, which continued to sweep across the rugged line of the coast, and only a quick dive to cover, wasting precious time cowering like trapped animals, saved them from discovery. But at least the hound did not bay again on the tangled trail they left, and they hoped that the trap and the clack-clacks had put that monster permanently out of service. On the third day they came down to one of those fjords which tongued inland, fringing the coast. There had been no lack of hunting in the narrow valleys through which they had threaded, so both men and wolverines were well fed. Though animal fur wore better than the now tattered uniforms of the men. Now where? Shan asked. Would he now learn the purpose, driving Thorvald on to this coastland? Certainly, such broken country afforded good hiding, but no better concealment than the mountains of the interior. The survey officer tried... Nope, no he did not. The survey officer turned slowly around on the shingle, studying the heights behind them as well as the angle of the inlet, where the wavelets lapped almost at their battered boot tips. Opening his treasured map case, he began a patient checking of landmarks against several of the strips he carried. We'll have to get on down to the true coast. Shan leaned against the trunk of a conical, branched mountain tree, pulling absently at the shreds of wine-colored bark being shed in seasonal change. The chill they had known in the upper valleys was succeeded there by a humid warmth. Spring was becoming a summer, such as this northern continent knew. Even the fresh wind blowing in from the outer sea had already lost some of the bite they had felt 2 days before when its salt-laden mistiness had first struck them. Then what do we do there? Shan persisted. Thorvald brought over the map, his black-rimmed nail tracing the route down one of the fjords, slanting out to indicate a lace of islands extending in a beaded line across the sea. We head for these. To Shan, that made no sense at all. Those islands. Why, they would offer less chance of establishing a safe base than the broken land in which they now stood. Even the survey scouts had given those spots of sea-encircled earth the most cursory examination from the air. Why? He asked bluntly. So far he had followed orders because they had, for the most part, made sense. But he was not giving obedience to Thorvald as a matter of rank alone. Because there is something out there, something which may make all the difference now. Warlock isn't an empty world. Honey Lemon, thank you so much for contributing to Sunday's stream. Shan jerked free a long thong of loose bark, rolling it between his fingers. Had Thorvald cracked? He knew that the officer had disagreed with the findings of the team and had been an unconvinced minority of one who had refused to subscribe to the report that Warlock had no native intelligent life, and therefore was ready and waiting for human settlement because it was technically an empty world. But to continue to cling to that belief without a single concrete proof was certainly a sign of mental imbalance. And Thorvald was regarding him now with frowning impatience. You were supposed to humor delusions, weren't you? Only, could you surrender and humor a wild idea which might mean your death? If Thorvald wanted to go island hopping in chance of discovering what never had existed, Shan need not accompany him. And if the officer tried to use force, well, Shan was armed with a stunner and had, he believed, more control over the wolverines. Perhaps if he merely gave lip agreement to this project. Only he didn't believe, noting the light deep in those gray eyes holding on him, that anybody could talk Thorvald out of this particular obsession. Hey, Longsouls, welcome in. Thanks for contributing to Sunday's stream. You don't believe me, do you? The impatience arose hotly in that demand. Why should I? Shan tried to temporize. You've had a lot of exploration experience. You should know about such things. I don't pretend to be any authority. Thorvald refolded the map and placed it in the case. Then he pulled at the ceiling of his blouse, groping in an inner secret pocket. He uncurled his fingers to display his treasure. On his palm lay a coin-shaped medallion, bone-white, but possessing an odd luster which bone would not normally show. And it was carved. Shan put out a finger, though he had a strange reluctance to touch the object. When he did, he experienced a sensation close to the tingle of a mild electric shock. And once he had made that contact, he was also impelled to pick up that disc and examine it more closely. The carved pattern was very intricate and had been done with great delicacy and skill, though the whorls, oddly shaped knobs, ribbon tracings, made no connected design he could determine. After a moment or two of study, Shan became aware that his eyes, following those twists and twirls, were fixed, that it required a distinct effort to look away from the thing. Feeling some of that same alarm as he had known when he first heard the wailings of the Throg hound, he let the disc fall back into Thorvald's hold, even more disturbed when he discovered that to relinquish his grasp required some exercise of will. What is it? Thorvald restored the coin to his hiding place. You tell me. I can say this much. There is no listing for anything even remotely akin to this in the archives. Shan's eyes widened. He absently rubbed the finger which had held the bone coin, if it was a coin, back and forth across the torn front of his blouse. That tingle. Did he still feel it? Or was his imagination at work again? But an object not listed in the exhaustive survey archives would mean some totally new civilization, a new stellar race. It is definitely a created article, the survey officer continued, and it was found on the beach of one of those sea islands. Throg? But Shan already knew the answer to that. Throg work? This? Thorvald was openly scornful. Throgs have no conception of such art. You must have seen their metal plates. Those are the beetle's idea of beauty. Have those the slightest resemblance to this? Then who made it? Either Warlock has, or once had, a native race advanced enough in a well-established form of civilization to develop such a sophisticated type of art, or there have been other visitors from space here before us and the Throgs, and the latter possibility I don't believe. Why? Because this was carved of bone or an allied substance. We haven't been able to identify it in the labs, but it is basically organic material. It was found exposed to the weather, and yet it is in perfect condition. Could have been carved any time within the last 5 years. It has been handled, yes, but not roughly. And we have come across evidence of no other star-cruising races or species save ourselves and the Throgs. No. I say this was made here on Warlock not too long ago, and by intelligent beings of a very high grade of civilization. But they would have cities, protested Shan. We've been here for months, explored all over this continent. We would have seen them, or some traces of them. An old race, maybe, Thorvald mused. A very old race, perhaps in decline, reduced to a remnant in numbers with good reason to retire into hiding. No, we've discovered no cities, no evidence of a native culture, past or present, but this, he touched the front of his blouse, was found on the shore of an island. We may have been looking in the wrong place for our natives. The sea. Shan glanced with new interest at the green water surging in wavelets along the edge of the fjord. Just so. The sea. But scouts have been here for more than a year, one team or another, and nobody saw anything or found any traces. All 4 of our base camps were set inland. Our explorations along the coast were mainly carried out by flitter, except for one party, the one which found this. And there may be excellent local reasons why any native never showed himself to us. For that matter, they may not be able to exist on land at all, any more than we could live without artificial aids in the sea. Now we must make a real attempt to find them, if they do exist anywhere near here. A friendly native race could make all the difference in the world in any struggle with the Throgs. Then you did have more than the dream to back you when you argued with Finiston, Shan cut in. Thorvald's eyes were on him again. When did you hear that, Lanty? To his great embarrassment, Shan found himself flushing. I heard you the day you left for headquarters, he admitted, and then added in his own defense. Probably half the camp did, too. Thorvald's gathering frown flickered away. He gave a snort of laughter. Yeah, I guess we did rather get to the bellowing point that morning. The dreams... He came back to the subject. Yes, the dreams are important. We had their warning from the start. Lori was the first in Scout who charted Warlock, and he is a good man. I guess I can break secret now to tell you that his ship was equipped with a new experimental device which recorded, well, you might call it an emanation, a radiation so faint its source could not be traced, and it registered whenever Lori had one of those dreams. Unfortunately, the machine was very new, very much in the untested stage, and its performance, when checked later in the lab, was erratic enough so the powers that be questioned all its readings. They produced a half-dozen answers to account for that tape, and Lori only caught the recording as long as he was on a big bay to the south. Then when 2 check flights came in later, carrying perfected machines and getting no recordings, it was all written off as a mistake in the first experiment. A planet such as Warlock is too big a find to throw away when there was no proof of occupancy, and the settlement boys rushed matters right along. Shan recalled his own vivid dream on the skull rock set in the lap of water, this sea. And another small point fell into place to furnish the beginning of a pattern. I was asleep on the raft when I dreamed about this skull mountain, he said slowly, wondering if he were making any sense. Thorvald's head came up with the alert stance of Taggy on a strong game scent. You. Yes. On the raft you dreamed of Skull Rock, and I of a cavern with a green veil. But both of us were on the water. Water which had an eventual connection to the sea. Could water be a conductor? I wonder. Once again his hand went into his blouse. He crossed the strip of gravel beach, and dipped fingers into the water, letting the drops fall on the carved disc he now held in his other hand. What are you doing? Shan could see no purpose in that. Thorvald did not answer. He had pressed wet hand to dry now, palm to palm, the coin cupped tightly between them. He turned a quarter circle to face the still distant, open sea. That way. He spoke with a new odd tonelessness. Shan stared into the other's face. All the eager alertness of only a moment earlier had been wiped away. Thorvald was no longer the man he had known, but in some frightening way a husk, holding a quite different personality. The younger Terran answered his fear with an attack from the old days of rough infighting in the dumps of Tyr. He brought his right hand down hard with a sharp chop across the officer's wrist. The bone coin spun to the sand and Thorvald stumbled, staggering forward a step or 2. Before he could recover balance, Shan had stamped on the medallion. Thorvald whirled, his stunner drawn with the speed for which Shan gave him high marks. But the younger man's own weapon was already out and ready, and he talked. Fast. That thing's dangerous. What did you do? What did you do to it? What did it do to you? His demand got through to Thorvald, who was himself again. What was I doing? Came a counter-demand. You are acting like a mind-controlled. Thorvald stared at him incredulously, then with a growing spark of interest. The minute you dripped water on the thing, you changed, Shan continued. Thorvald reholstered his stunner. Yes, he mused. Why did I want to drip water on it? Something prompted me. He ran his still, damp hand on the angle of his jaw, across his forehead, as if to relieve some pain there. What else did I do? Faced to the sea and said, that way, Shen replied promptly. And why did you move in to stop me? Shan shrugged. When I first touched that thing, I felt a shock. And I've seen mind-controlled. He could have bitten his tongue for betraying that. The world of the mind-controlled was very far from the life Thorvald and his kind knew. Very interesting, commented the other. For one of so few years, you seem to have seen a lot, Lanty, and apparently remembered most of it. But I would agree that you are right about this little plaything. It carries a danger with it, being far less innocent than it looks. He tore off one of the fluttering scraps of rag which now made up his sleeve. If you'll just remove your foot, we'll put it out of business for now. He proceeded to wrap the disc well in his bit of cloth, taking care not to touch it again with his bare fingers while he stowed it away. I don't know what we have in this. A key to unlock a door, a trap to catch the unwary. I can't guess how or why it works, but we can be reasonably sure it's not just some carefree maiden's locket, nor the equivalent of a credit to spend in the nearest bar. So it pointed me to the sea, did it? Well, that much I am willing to allow. Maybe we'll be able to return it to an owner after we learn who or what that owner is. Shan gazed down at the green water, opaque, not to be pierced to the depths of human sight. Anything might lurk there. Suddenly the Throgs became normal when balanced against an unknown living in the murky depths of an aquatic world. Another attack on the Throg-held camp could be well preferred to such exploration as Thorvald had in mind. Yet Shan did not voice any protest as the survey officer faced again in the same direction as the disc had pointed him moments before. End of chapter 7. Oh, Noodles, thank you for the book suggestion. Thank you, thank you. I am liking it. I'm thinking it's a little like the writing style is not as immersive as I think I want it to be. And I don't know if it's because we're not always within, I don't know, like both of their heads, like we don't have both of their thoughts all of the time. And sometimes I feel like she gets an idea and she immediately wants to put it in instead of necessarily having it like more thought out, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily characteristic Falcor. Yeah, there are some, like this one definitely feels like it's told like at like a distance, like there's like a veil between you and the actual story, and that's not always the case. Yeah, and it's not fully grabbing you either. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of compelling sci-fi, absolutely. And I don't know if this is, because this is the first book that I've read by Andre Norton, and I don't know if this is always her style or if it's like a different tone for this one. I'm not really sure. I am intrigued by the disc. Yes, as what? Same. And yeah, it's interesting that like Shan felt the electric shock and then it like almost controlled or like possessed Thorvald. So I think that's interesting and cool. And also like murky water creatures is terrifying. That's true. Sci-fi is very, very broad. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, Buck Rogers and Blade Runner are both sci-fi, but they are nothing alike. Yeah, yeah. Very true. But yeah, I think this one is more like doesn't like suck you into the story. Murky water creatures, people who take baths. That's true. That's true. Well said, honey lemon. Oh man, I love that. I'm gonna only refer to people who take baths as murky water creatures. Oof. All right. Chapter 8. We're 36% of the way through. Not too shabby. Chapter 8. Utgard. I'm gonna spell it out so you can see like there. So you can see what I'm seeing. A wind from the west sprang up an hour before sunset, lashing waves inland until their spray was a salt mist in the air, a mist to sodden clothing, plaster hair to the skull, leaving a brine slime across the skin. Yet Thorvald hunted no shelter, in spite of the promise in the rough shoreline at their backs. The sand in which their boots slipped and slid was coarse stuff, hardly finer than gravel, studded with nets of drift, bone white or grayed or pale lavender, smoothed and stored by the seasons of low tides and high, seasonal storms and hurricanes, a wild shore and a forbidding one, to arouse Shan's distrust, perhaps a fitting goal for that disk's guide. Shan had tasted loneliness in the mountains, experienced the strange world of the river at night lighted by the wan radiance of glowing shrubs and plants, forced the starkness of the heights. Yet there had been through all that journeying a general resemblance to his own past on other worlds. A tree was a tree, whether it bore purple foliage or was red-veined. A rock was a rock, a river, a river. They were equally hard and wet on Warlock or Tyr. But now a veil he could not describe, even in his own thoughts, hung between him and the sand over which he walked, between him and the sea which sent spray to wet his torn clothes, between him and that wild rack of long ago storms. He could put out his hand and touch sand, drift, spray, yet they were a setting where something lay hidden behind that setting, something watched, calculatingly, with intelligence, and a set of emotions and values he did not, could not share. Storm coming. Thorvald paused in the buffeting of wind and spray, watching the fury of the tossing sea. The sun was still a pale smear just above the horizon, and it gave light enough to make out that trickle of islands melting out to obscurity. Utgard. Utgard, Shan repeated, the strange word holding no meaning for him. Legend of my people. Thorvald smeared spray from his face with one hand. Utgard, those outermost islands where dwell the giants who are the mortal enemies of the old gods. Those dark lumps, most of them bare rock, only a few crowned with stunted vegetation, might well harbor anything, Shan decided. Giants or the malignant spirits of any race. Perhaps even the Throgs had their tales of evil things in the night, beetle monsters to people wild, unknown lands. He caught at Thorvald's arm and suggested a practical course of action. We need shelter before the storm strikes. To Shan's relief, the other nodded. I wonder if they tell people to touch sand on the planets the way they touch grass here. Probably. Probably. They trailed back across the beach, their backs now to the sea and Utgard. That harsh-sounding name did so well fit the line of islands and islets. Shan repeated it to himself. Here the beach was narrow, a strip of blue sand gravel walled by wave-worn boulders, and from that barrier of stones piled into a breastwork by chance, interwoven with bone-bare drift, arose the first of the cliffs. Shan studied the terrain with increasingly uneasiness. To be caught between a sea, whipped inland by a storm wind, and that cliff would be a risk he did not like to consider, as ignorant of field lore as he was. They must locate some break nearer than the fjord, down which they had come, and they must find it soon, before the daylight was gone and the full fury of bad weather struck. In the end, the Wolverines discovered an exit, just as they had found the passage through the mountain. Taggy nosed into a darker line down the face of the cliff and disappeared, Togi duplicating that feat. Shan trailed them, finding the opening a tight squeeze. He squirmed into dimness, his outstretched hands meeting a rough stone surface sloping upward. After gaining a point about 8 feet above the beach, he was able to look back and down through the seaward slit. Open to the sky, the crevice proved a doorway to a narrow valley, not unlike those which housed the fjords, but provided with a thick growth of vegetation well protected by the high walls. Working as a now well-rehearsed team, the men set up a shelter of saplings and brush, the back to the slit through which wind was still able to tear away. Walled in by stone and knowing that no Throg flyer would attempt to fly in the face of the coming storm, they dared make a fire. The warmth was a comfort to their bodies, just as the light of the flames, men's old age hearth companion, was a comfort to the fugitive's spirit. Those dancing spheres of red, for Shan at least, burned away that veil of otherworldliness which had enwrapped the beach, providing in the light an illusion of the home he had never really known. But the wind and the weather did not keep truce very long. A wailing blast around the upper peaks produced a caterwauling to equal the voices of half a dozen Throg hounds, and in their poor shelter the Terrans not only heard the thunderous boom of surf, but felt the vibration of that beat pounding through the very ground on which they lay. The sea must have long since covered the beach over which they had come, and was now trying its strength against the rock of the cliff barrier. They could not talk to each other over that din, although shoulder touched shoulder. The last flush of amber vanished from the sky with the speed of a dropped curtain. Tonight, no period of twilight divided night from day, but their portion of Warlock was plunged abruptly into darkness. The Wolverines crowded into their small haven, whining deep in their throats. Shan ran his hand along their furred bodies, trying to give them a reassurance he himself did not feel. Never before, when on stable land, had he been so aware of the unleashed terrors night could exert. The forces against which all mankind's controls were as nothing. Time could no longer be measured by any set of minutes or hours. There was only darkness, the howling winds, and the salty rain which must be in part the breath of the sea driven in upon them. The comforting fire vanished. Chill and dankness crept up to cramp their bodies, so that now and again they were forced to their feet, to swing arms, stamp, drive the blood into faster circulation. Later came a time when the wind died, no longer driving the rain bullet hard against and through their flimsy shelter. Then they slept in the thick unconsciousness of exhaustion. A red-purple skull, and from its eye sockets the flying things kept coming, going. Shan trod on an unsteady foundation which dipped under his weight as had the raft of the river voyage. He was drawing nearer to that great head, could see now how waves curled about the angle of the lower jaw, slapping inward between gaps of missing teeth, which were really broken fangs of rock, as if the skull now and then sucked reviving moisture from the water. The aperture marking the nose was closer to a snout, and the hole was dark, dark as the empty eye sockets. Yet that darkness was drawing him past any effort to escape he could summon. And then that on which he rode so perilously was carried forward by the waves, grated against the jawbone, while against his own fighting will his own fighting will his hands rose above his head, reaching for a hold to draw his shrinking body up the stark surface to that snout passage. Lanty! A hand jerked him back, broke that compulsion and the dream. Shan opened his eyes with difficulty. His lashes seemed glued to his cheeks. He might have been surveying a submerged world. Thin streamers of fog twined up from the earth as if they grew from seeds planted by the storm, but there was no wind, no sound from the peaks. Only under his stiff body, Shan could still feel that vibration which was the sea battering against the cliff wall. Thorvald was crouched beside him, his hand still urgent on the younger man's shoulder. The officer's face was drawn so finely that his features, sharp under the tanned skin, were akin to the skull Shan still half saw among the ascending pillars of fog. "Storm's over." Shan shivered as he sat up, hugging his arms to his chest, his tattered uniform soggy under that pressure. He felt as if he would never be warm again. When he moved sluggishly to the pit where they kindled their handful of fire the night before, he realized that the wolves were missing. "Taggy?" His voice sounded rusty in his own ears, as if some of the moisture thick in the air about them had affected his vocal cords. "Hunting." Thorvald's answer was clipped. He was gathering a handful of sticks from the back of their lean-to, where the protection of their own bodies had kept that kindling dry. Shan snapped a length between his hands, dropped it into the pit. When they did coax a blaze into being, they stripped, wringing out their clothing, propped it piece by steaming piece on sticks by the warmth of the flames. The moist air bit at their bodies, and they moved briskly, striving to keep warm by exercise. Still the fog curled, undisturbed by any shaft of sun. "Did you dream?" Thorvald asked abruptly. "Yes." Shan did not elaborate. Disturbing as his dream had been, the feeling that it was not to be shared was also strong as some order. "And so did I," Thorvald said bleakly. "You saw your skull mountain?" "I was climbing it when you awoke me," Shan returned unwillingly. "And I was going through my green veil when Taggy took off and wakened me. You are sure your skull exists?" "Yes." "And so am I that the cavern of the veil is somewhere on this world. But why?" Thorvald stood up, the firelight marking plainly the lines between his tanned arms, his brown face and throat, and the paleness of his lean body. "Why do we dream those particular dreams?" Shan tested the dryness of his shirt. He had no reason to try and explain the wherefore of those dreams. Only was he certain that he would sometime, somewhere, find that skull, and that when he did, he would climb to the doorway of the snout, pass behind the depths where the flying things might nest, not because he wanted to make such an expedition, but because he must. He drew his hands across his ribs, where pressure still brought an aching reminder of the crushing force of the energy whip the Throgs had wielded. There was no extra flesh on his body, yet muscles slid easily under the skin, a darker skin than Thorvald's, deepening to a warm brown where it had been weathered. His hair, unclipped now for a month, was beginning to curl about his head in tight, dark rings. Since he had always been the youngest, or the smallest, or the weakest in the world of the dumps, of the service, of the team, Shan had very little personal vanity. He did possess a different type of pride, born of his own stubborn achievement in winning out over a long roster of discouragements, failures, and adverse odds. "Why do we dream?" He repeated Thorvald's question. No answer, sir. He gave the traditional reply of the service recruit, and a little to his surprise, Thorvald laughed, with a tinge of real amusement. Where do you come from, Lanty? He asked, as if he were honestly interested. Tyr. Calden Mines. The survey officer automatically matched planet to product. How did you come into survey? Shan drew on his shirt. Signed on as casual labor, he returned with a spark of defiance. Thorvald had joined the service the right way, as a cadet, then a team man, finally an officer, climbing that nice, even ladder with every rung ready for him when he was prepared to mount it. What did his kind know about the labor barracks, where the dull-minded, the failures, the petty criminals on the run lived hard under a secret social system of their own? It had taken every bit of physical endurance and energy, every fraction of stubborn will Shan could summon for him to survive his first 3 months in those barracks, unbroken and still eager to be survey. He could still wonder at the unbelievable chance which had rescued him from that merely because training center had needed another odd hand to clean cages and feed troughs for the experimental animals. And from the center he made a team, because when working in a smaller group, his push and attention to duty had been noticed and had paid off. 3 years it had taken, but he had made team stature. Not that that meant anything now. Shan pulled his boots on over the legs of rough, dried coveralls and glanced up, to find Thorvald watching him with a new, questioning directness the younger man could not understand. Shan sealed his blouse and stood up, knowing the bite of hunger, dull but persistent. It was a feeling he had had so many times in the past that now he hardly gave it a second thought. Supplies? He brought the subject back to the present and the practical. What did it matter why or how one Shan Lanty had come to Warlock in the first place? What we had left of the concentrates we had better keep for emergencies. Thorvald made no move to open the very shrunken bag he had brought up from the scout ship. He walked over to a rocky outcrop and tugged loose a yellowish tuft of plant, neither moss nor fungi, but sharing attributes of both. Shan recognized it, without enthusiasm, as one of the varieties of native produce which could be safely digested by Terran stomachs. The stuff was almost tasteless, and possessed a rather unpleasant odor. Consumed in bulk, it would satisfy hunger for a time. Shan hoped that with the wolverines to aid, they could go back to hunting soon. However, Thorvald showed no desire to head inland where they might expect to locate game. He disagreed with Shan's suggestion for tracking Taggy and Togi when those two emerged from the underbrush, obviously well-fed and contented after their early morning activity. When Shan protested with some heat, the other countered, "Didn't you ever hear of fish, Lanty? After a storm, such as last night's, we ought to discover good pickings along the shore." But Shan was also sure that it was not only the thought of food which drew Thorvald back to sea. Have a good lark. They crawled back through the bolt hole. The beach of gravel sand had vanished, save for a narrow ribbon of land just at the foot of the cliffs, where the water curled in white lace about the barrier of boulders. There was no change in the dullness of the sky. No sun broke through the thick lid of clouds, and the green of the sea was ashened to gray, which matched that overcast, until one could strain one's eyes trying to find the horizon, unable to mark the dividing line here between air and water. Utgard was a broken necklace, the outermost island beads lost, the inner ones more isolated by the rise in water, more forbidding. Shan let out a startled hiss of breath. The top of a nearby rock detached itself, drew up into a hunched thing of armor-plated scales and heavy, wide-jawed head. A tail cracked into the air, a double tail split into equal forks for halfway down its length, a leg lifted as a forefoot, webbed, clawed for a new hold. This sea beast was the most formidable native thing he had sighted on Warlock, approaching in its ugliness the hound of the Throgs. Breathing in labored gusts, the thing slapped its tail down on the stones with a limpness which suggested that the raising of that appendage had overtaxed its limited supply of strength. The head sank forward, resting across one of the forelimbs. Then Shan sighted the fearsome wound in the side just before one of the larger hind legs, a ragged hole through which pumped with every one of those breaths a dark purplish stream, licked away by the waves as it trickled slickly down the rock. "What is that?" Corvald shook his head. "Not on our records," he replied absently, studying the dying creature with avid attention. "Must have been driven in by the storm. This proves there is more in the sea than we knew." Again, the forked tail lifted and fell, the head raised from the forelimb, stretching up and back until the white underfolds of the throat were exposed as the snout pointed almost vertically to the sky. The jaws opened, and from between them came a moaning whistle, a complaint which was drowned out by the wash of the waves. Then, as if that was the last effort, the webbed, clawed feet relaxed their grip of the rock, and the scaled body slid sidewise, out of their sight, into the water. There was a feather of spume to mark the plumage, and nothing else. Shan, watching to see if the reptile would surface again, sighted another object, a rounded shape floating on the sea, bobbing lightly, as had their river raft. "Look!" Thorvald's gaze followed his pointing finger, and then before Shan could protest, the officer leaped outward from their perch on the cliff to the broad rock where the scaled sea-dweller had lain moments earlier. He stood there, watching that drifting object with the closest attention, as Shan made the same crossing in his wake. The drifting thing was oval, perhaps some 6 feet long and 3 wide, the midpoint rising in a curve from the water's edge. As far as Shan could make out in the half-light, the color was a reddish-brown, the surface rough, and he thought by the way that it moved that it must be flotsam of the storm, buoyant enough to ride the wave with close-to-cork resiliency. To Shan's dismay, his companion began to strip. "What are you going to do?" "Get that." Shan surveyed the water about the rock. The forked tail had sunk just there. Was the survey officer mad enough to think he could swim unmenaced through a sea which might be infested with more such creatures? It seemed that he was, for Thorvald's white body arched out in a dive. Shan waited, half-crouched and tense, as though he could in some way attack anything rising from the depths to strike at his companion. A brown arm flashed above the surface. Thorvald swam strongly toward the floating object. He reached it, his outstretched hand rasping across the surface, and it responded so quickly to that touch that Shan guessed it was even lighter and easier to handle than he had at first thought. Thorvald headed back, herding the thing before him, and when he climbed out on the rock, Shan was pulling up his trophy. They flipped the find over to discover it hollow. They had, in effect, a ready-made craft not unlike a canoe, with blunted bows. But the substance was surely organic. Was it shell? Shan speculated, running his fingertips over the irregular surface. The survey officer dressed. "We have our boat," he commented. "Now, for Utgard. Use this frail thing to dare the trip to the islands?" But Shan did not protest. And if the officer determined to try such a voyage, he would do it. And neither did the younger man doubt that he would accompany Thorvald. End of chapter 8. So it seems like I've been trying to think of what it is that is missing. And it seems like things are happening, but at the same time, it seems like nothing is happening, if that makes sense. Like, that chapter was like 20 something minutes. You think it's the emotion that's missing? That's a good point. Yes. It's a step away from being interesting between Shan and Thorvald. It is a good story. Yes. I think so too. There's just like the little like salt. There's not enough salt in the soup to make it amazing. Mhm. I agree. It's like so close to being like ultra engaging. All right. Chapter 9. One alone. It's like when you break bread and you did so well, but you forgot to add the salt. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly where you're like, there's something missing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not that it's bad. Yeah. Uh-huh. That's a good analogy. Absolutely. All right. Chapter 9. One alone. Once again, the beach was a wide expanse of shingle, drying fast under a sun hotter than any Shan had yet known on Warlock. Summer had taken a deep leap forward. The Terrans worked in partial shade below a cliff overhang, not only for the protection against the sun's rays, but also as a precaution against any roving Throg air patrol. Under Thorvald's direction, the curious shell dragged from the sea. If it were a shell, and the texture as well as the general shape suggested that, was equipped with a framework to act as a stabilizing outrigger. What resulted was certainly an odd-looking craft, but one which obeyed the paddles and rode the waves easily. In the full sunlight, the outline of islands was clear-cut, red and gray rock above an aquamarine sea. The Terrans had sighted no more of the sea monsters, and the major evidence of native life along the shore was a new species of clacks, roosting in cliff holes and scavenging along the sands, and various odd fish and shelled things stranded in small tide pools, to the delight of the wolverines, who fished eagerly up and down the beach, ready to investigate all debris of the storm. That should serve. Thorvald tightened the last lashing, straightening up, his fists resting on his hips, to regard the craft with a measure of pride. Shan was not quite so content. He had matched the survey officer in industry, but the need for haste still eluded him. So the ship, such as it was ready. Now they would be off to explore Thorvald's Utgard. But a small and nagging doubt inside the young man restrained his enthusiasm over such a voyage. Forktail had come out of the section of ocean which they must navigate in this very crude transport, and Shan had no desire to meet an uninjured and alert Forktail in the latter's own territory. Which island do we head for? Shan kept private his personal doubts of their success. The outmost tip of that chain was only a distant smudge lying low on the water. The largest, that one with trees. Shan whistled. Since the night of the storm, the Wolverines were again more amenable to the very light discipline he tried to keep. Perhaps the fury of that elemental burst had tightened the bond between men and animals, both alien to his world. Now Taggy and his mate padded toward him in answer to his summons, but would the Wolverines trust the boat? Shan dared not risk their swimming, nor would he agree to leaving them behind. Thorvald had already stored their few provisions on board, and now Shan steadied the craft against a rock which served them as a wharf while he coaxed Taggy gently. Though the Wolverine protested, he at last scrambled in, to hunch at the bottom of the shell, the picture of apprehension. Togi took longer to make up her mind. and at length Shan picked her up bodily, soothing her with quiet speech and stroking hands, and put her beside her mate. The shell settled under the weight of the passengers, but Thorvald's foresight concerning the use of the outrigger proved right, for the craft was seaworthy. It answered readily to the dip of their paddles as they headed in a curve, keeping the first of the islands between them and the open sea for a breakwater. From the air, Thorvald's curse would have been a crooked one, for he wove back and forth between the scattered islands of the chain, using their lee calm for the protection of the canoe. About 2/3 of the group were barren rock, inhabited only by clack-clacks and creatures closer to true Terran birds, in that they wore a body plumage which resembled feathers, though their heads were naked and leathery. And Shan noted, the clack-clacks and the birds did not roost on the same islands, each choosing their own particular home, while the other species did not invade that territory. The first large-sized island they approached was crowded by trees, but it had no beach, no approach from sea level. Perhaps it might be possible to climb to the top of the cliff walls, but Thorvald did not suggest that they try it, heading on toward the next large outcrop of land and rock. Here, white lace patterned in a ring well out from the shore to mark a circle of reefs. They nosed their way patiently around the outer circumference of that threatening barrier, hunting the entrance to the lagoon. Within, there were at least 2 beaches with climbable ascents to the upper reaches inland, though Shan noted that the vegetation showing was certainly not luxuriant, the few trees within their range of vision being pallid growths, rather like those they had sighted on the fringe of the desert. Leather-headed flyers wheeled out over their canoe, coasting on outspread wings to peer down at the Terran invaders in a manner which suggested intelligent curiosity. A full flock gathered to escort them as they continued along the outer line of the reef. Thorvald impatiently dug his paddle deeper. They had explored more than half of the reef now without chancing on an entrance channel. Regular fence. Oh, wrong voice. My bad. Regular fence, Shan commented. One could begin to believe that the barrier had been deliberately reared to frustrate visitors. Hot sunshine reflected back from the surface of the waves burned their exposed skin, so they dared not discard their ragged clothing. And the wolverines were growing increasingly restless. Shan did not know how much longer the animals would consent to their position as passengers without raising active protest. "How about trying the next one?" he asked, knowing at the same time his companion was not in any mood to accept such a suggestion with goodwill. The officer made no reply, but continued to use his steer paddle in a fashion which spelled out his stubborn determination to find a passage. This was a personal thing now, between Ragnar Thorvald of the Terran Survey and a wall of rock, and the man's will was as strongly rooted as those water-washed stones. On the southwestern tip of the reef they discovered a possible opening. Shan eyed the narrow space between 2 fang-like rocks dubiously. To him, that width of water lane seemed dangerously limited. The sudden slam of a wave could dash them against either of those pillars, with disastrous results, before they could move to save themselves. But Thorvald pointed their blunt bow toward the passage with seeming confidence, and Shan knew that as far as the officer was concerned, this was their door to the lagoon. Thorvald might be stubborn, but he was not a fool, and his training and skill in such maneuvers was proved when the canoe rode in a rising swell in and by those rocks to gain the safety, in seconds, of the calm lagoon. Shan sighed with relief, but ventured no comment. Now they must paddle back along the inner side of the reef to locate the beaches, for fronting them on this side of the well-protected island were cliffs as formidable as those which guarded the first of the chain at which they had aimed. Shan glanced now and then over the side of the boat, hoping in these shallows to sight the seabed or some of the inhabitants of these waters. but there was no piercing that green murk. Here and there nodules of rock projected inches or feet above the surface, awash in the wavelets, to be avoided by the voyagers. Shan's shoulders ached and burned. His muscles were unaccustomed to the steady swing of the paddles, and the fire of the sun stabbed easily through only 2 layers of ragged cloth to his skin. He ran a dry tongue over drier lips and gazed eagerly ahead in search of the first of the beaches. What was so important about this island that Thorvald had to make a landing here? The officers' stories of a native race which they might turn against the Throgs to their own advantage was thin, very thin indeed, especially now, as Shan weighed in unsupported theory against that ache in his shoulders, the possibility of being marooned on the inhospitable shore ahead, against the 50 probable dangers he could total up with very little expenditure of effort. A small, nagging doubt of Thorvald's obsession began to grow in his mind. How could Shan even be sure that that carved disc and Thorvald's hocus pocus with it had been on the level? On the other hand, what motive would the officer have for trying such an act just to impress Shan? The beach, at last. As they headed the canoe in that direction, the wolverines nearly brought disaster on them. The animals' restlessness became acute as they sighted and scented the shore and knew that they were close. Taggy reared, plunged over the side of the craft, and Shan had just time to fling his weight in the opposite direction as a counterbalance when Togi followed. They splashed shoreward while Thorvald swore fluently, and Shan grabbed to save the precious supply bag. In a shower of gravel, the animals made land and humped well up on the strand before pausing to shake themselves and splatter far and wide the burden of moisture transported by their shaggy fur. Ashore, the canoe became a clumsy burden, and, light as the craft was, both of the men sweated to get it up on the beach without snagging the outrigger against stones and brush. With the thought of a Throg patrol in mind, they worked swiftly to cover it. Taggy raised an egg-patterned snout from a hollow and licked at the stippling of greenish yolk matting his fur. The wolverines had wasted no time in sampling the contents of a wealth of nesting places, beginning just above the high water mark, cupping 2 to 4 tough-shelled eggs in each. Treading a path among those clutches, the Terrans climbed a red-earthed slope toward the interior of the island. They found water. Not the clear running of a mountain spring, but a stallish pool in a stone-walled depression on the crest of a rise, filled by the bounty of the rain. The warm liquid was brackish, but satisfied in part their thirst, and they drank eagerly. The outer cliff wall of the island was just that, a wall, for there was an inner slope to match the outer, and at the bottom of it a showing of purple-green foliage where plants and stunted trees fought for living space. But there was nothing else, though they quartered that growing section with the care of men trying to locate an enemy outpost. That night they camped in the hollow, roasted eggs in a fire, and ate the fishy-tasting contents because it was food, not because they realized what they swallowed. Tonight, no cloud bank hung overhead. A man, gazing up, could see the stars and other things, for over the distant shore of the mainland they sighted the cruising lights of a Throg ship, and waited tensely for that circle of small, sparkling points to swing out towards their own hiding hole. They haven't given up, Shan stated what was obvious to them both. The settler transport, Thorvald reminded him. They do not take a prisoner to talk her in and allay suspicion. Then, he snapped his fingers. The patrol will be on their tails, but quick. So just by keeping out of Throg range, they were, in a way, still fighting. Shan settled back, his tender shoulders resting against a tree hole. He tried to count the number of days and nights lying behind him now, since that early morning when he had watched the Terran camp die under the aliens' weapons. But one day faded into another, so that he could remember only action parts clearly. The attack on the grounded scout ship, the sortie they had made in turn on the occupied camp, the dust storm on the river, the escape from the Throg ship in the mountain crevice, and their meeting with the Hound. Then that storm which had driven them to seek cover after their curious experience with the disc, and now this day, when they had safely reached the island. "Why this island?" he asked suddenly. "That carved piece was found here on the edge of this valley," Thorvald returned matter-of-factly. "But today we found nothing at all, yet this island supplies us with a starting point." A starting point of what? A detailed search of all the islands, great and small, in the chain? And how did they dare continue to paddle openly from one to the next with the Throgs sweeping the skies? They would have provided an excellent target today as they combed that reef for an hour or more. Wearily, Shan spread out his hands in the very faint light of their tiny fire, poked with a fingertip at smarting points, which would have been blisters had those hands not known a toughening process in the past. More paddling tomorrow? But that was tomorrow, and at least they need not worry tonight about any Throg attack once they had doused the fire, an action which was now being methodically attended to by Thorvald. Shan pushed down on the bed of leaves he had heaped together. The night was quiet. He could hear only the murmur of the sea, a lulling croon of sound to make one sleep deep, perhaps dreamlessly. Sun struck down, making a dazzle about him. Shan turned over drowsily in that welcome heat, stretching a little as might a cat at ease. Then he really awoke under the press of memory, and the need for alertness rode him once more. Beaten down grass, the burnt-out embers of last night's fire were beside him. But of Thorvald and the Wolverines there were no signs. Not only did he now lie alone, but he was possessed by the feeling that he had not been deserted only momentarily, that Taggy, Togi, and the survey officer were indeed gone. Shan sat up, got to his feet, breathing faster, a prickle of uneasiness spreading in him, bringing him to that inner slope, up it to the crest from which he could see that beach where last night they had concealed the canoe. Those lengths of brush and tufts of grass they had used for a screen were strewn about as if tossed in haste, and not too long before. For the canoe was out in the calm waters within the reef, the paddle blade wielded by its occupant flashing brightly in the sun. On the shingle below, the wolverines prowled back and forth, whining in bewilderment. "Thorvald!" Shan put the full force of his lungs into that hail, hearing the name ring from one of the small peaks at his back. But the man in the boat did not turn his head. There was no change in the speed of that paddle dip. Shan leaped down the outer slope of the beach, skidding the last few feet, saving himself from going headfirst into the water only by a painful wrench of his body. "Thorvald!" He tried calling again, but that head, bright under the sun, did not turn. There was no answer. Shan tore at his clothes and kicked off his boots. He did not think of the possibility of lurking sea monsters as he plunged into the water, swam for the canoe edging along the reef, plainly bound for the sea gate at the southwest. Shan was not a powerful swimmer. His first impetus gave him a good start, but after that he had to fight for each foot he gained, and the fear grew in him that the other would reach the reef passage before he could catch up. He wasted no more time trying to hail Thorvald, putting all his breath and energy into the effort of overtaking the craft. And he almost made it, his hand actually slipping along the log which furnished the balancing outrigger. As his fingers tightened on the slimy wood, he looked up and loosened that hold again in time perhaps to save his life. For when he ducked to let the water cover his head in an impromptu half-dive, Shan carried with him a vivid picture, a picture so astounding that he was a little dazed. Thorvald had stopped paddling at last, because that paddle had to be put to another use. Had Shan not released his hold on the log and gone under water, that crudely fashioned piece of wood might have broken his skull. He saw only too clearly the paddle raised in both hands as an ugly weapon, and Thorvald's face, convulsed in a spasm of rage which made it as inhuman as a Throg's. Sputtering and choking, Shan fought up to the air once more. The paddle was back at the task for which it had been carved. The canoe was underway again, its occupant paying no more attention to what lay behind than if he had successfully disposed of the man in the water. To follow would be only to invite another attack, and Shan might not be so lucky next time. He was not good enough a swimmer to try any tricks such as oversetting the canoe, not when Thorvald was an expert who could easily finish off a fumbling opponent. Hey Star, welcome in. Hello, hi. Shan swam warily to shore where the wolverines waited, unable yet to make sense of that attack in the lagoon. What had happened to Thorvald? What motive had led the other to leave Shan and the animals on this island? The island Thorvald had called a starting point in his search of the natives of Warlock. Or had every bit of that tall tale been invented by the survey officer for some obscure purpose of his own? Certainly no sane purpose. Against that logic, Shan could only set the carved disc, and he had only Thorvald's word that that had been discovered here. He dragged himself out of the water on his hands and knees and lay, winded and gasping. Taggy came up to lick his face, nuzzle him, making a small, bewildered whimpering, while above, the leather-headed birds called and swooped, fearful and angry for their disturbed nesting place. The Terran retched, coughed up water, and then sat up to look around. The spread of lagoon was bare. Thorvald must have rounded the south point of land and be very close to the reef passage, perhaps through it by now. Not stopping for his clothes, Shan started up the slope, crawling part of the way on his hands and knees. He reached the crest again and got to his feet. The sun made an eye-dazzling glitter of the waves, but under the shade of his hands Shan saw the canoe again, beyond the reef, heading on out along the island chain, not back to shore as he had expected. Thorvald was still on the hunt. But for what? A reality which existed, or a dream in his own disturbed brain? Shan sat down. He was very hungry, for that adventure in the lagoon had sapped his strength, and he was a prisoner along with the wolverines, a prisoner on an island which was half the size of the valley which held the survey camp. As far as he knew, the only supply of drinkable water was that tank of evil-smelling rain, which would be speedily evaporated by a sun such as the one now beating down on him. And between him and the shore was the sea, a sea which harbored such creatures as the fork-tail he had watched die. Thorvald was still steadily on course, not to the next island in the chain, a small, bare knob, but to the one beyond that. He could have been hurrying to a meeting. Where? And with what? Shan got to his feet, started down to the beach once more, sure, now that the officer had no intention of returning, that he was again on his own with only his wits and strength to keep him alive and somehow free of this water-washed prison. End of chapter 9. All right, so he's all alone. Again. Oh, and Star, thank you so much for contributing to Sunday's stream. Where you going, Thorvald? What you doing? You being possessed again? Is that disc possessing you and telling you to go specific places? Yeah, well, that escalated. Yes, it did. Yes, it did. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, it's tough because there is a good story here. When you think about it, you do want to know what happens next. There could have been a yes. It Yes. It absolutely could have been a much more intense chapter. Intense things were happening, but did we feel the danger as a reader? No. No, I think you're right. You're totally not that guy, Falkor. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're totally right. And I think that is a huge reason. And so what's interesting about Andre Norton is that she didn't start as a sci-fi writer, and I'm wondering if her other genres were like this because she wrote historical fiction. So I'm wondering if she's just more comfortable with historical fiction. She did historical fiction and then I think she moved to fantasy and then science fiction. So I'm just wondering if maybe science fiction just like isn't her jam, or if she still has this same like telling rather than showing in the other genres that she's read or that she's written. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, I totally agree with you. It is very much like, and then this happened, and then this happened. And I'm wondering, so there was a part in the chapter when Shanna's reflecting and saying that like looking back, he only remembers like the really big things. Like he only remembers the like the raid, the sortie, the storm, like those things. And it seems like a lot of this, because it is mostly from like Shan's perspective, is just like almost like how he's remembering it instead of like how it's happening. Like the things are happening, but it's told like he's remembering it rather than this is happening now and this is dangerous and this is how I feel and like my heart rate is beating and like all of those types of things. But being like, yeah, and then the boat, he was in the canoe and so I paddled out and I'm not a very good swimmer and like it's a good thing I like looked up when I did because if I didn't, then I would have gotten hit in the face. Yeah. Like that's a near death experience and I feel like it could have been a more near death feel, if that makes sense. The showing is a skill that applies to all fiction. Yeah, you're right. You're right. So maybe this is just like her style of writing. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. For reasons. It could have been developed. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is like the first book in a series, but no other books were published in the series. Oh my gosh, do not apologize. No, no, no. You're in good company. You're in the right community. um and I'm wondering, so this book was published in 60, 70, one of those. And I'm wondering if I don't know because if science fiction was her latest genre, then I would have thought that she would have been like a pro at showing, not telling by the time she got here. Maybe maybe her other works didn't do so well. And so she's like, maybe I'll try this. Maybe I'll try this. I don't know. It's hard to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I am out of water, so I'm gonna take a quick break. And while I'm away, I'm gonna run an ad just so that we don't get pre-rolls for a bit. Grandmaster Frankers, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. Hello, hello. Yes, bio break. So bio break for all. Okay. We are on chapter 10. A trap. for a trapper. We are 46% into this book. Okay, I got water, but I need to like sip it first. Oh, Star, thank you so much for redeeming Hydrate. Thank you. I will take you up on that offer. Yeah, towards like the end of that chapter, I was like, oh no, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. They change color in the sun, which is exciting. I have like two different ones. So this one changes to like a blue. Yeah. So like it doesn't work if it's like cloudy. Like it needs to be like a good sunny day. So this one's changes to blue, and then I have one that's like a really light pink that changes to like a maroon. You avoid the sun, so that would be wasted. Yeah. Fair, fair. You could just enjoy this color then. All right. Chapter 10. A trap for a trapper. Shan took up the piece of soft. Oh no, hold on. Sorry. It like went into sleep mode. I took too long. It's like, Moog, hurry up. You're too slow. There we go. Okay. Shan took up the piece of soft chalk-like stone he had found and drew another short white mark on the rust red of a boulder well above tide level. That made 3 such marks. 3 days since Thorvald had marooned him, and he was no nearer the shore now than he had been on that first morning. He sat where he was by the boulder, aware that he should be up, trying to climb to the less accessible nests of the seabirds. The prisoners, man and wolverines, had cleaned out all those they had discovered on beach and cliffs. But at the thought of more eggs, Shan's stomach knotted in pain, and he began to retch. There had been no sign of Thorvald since Shan had watched him steer between the 2 westward islands, and the younger Terran's faint hope that the officer would return had died. On the shore a few feet away lay his own pitiful attempt to solve the problem of escape. The force axe had vanished with Thorvald, along with all the rest of the meager supplies which had been the officer's original contribution to their joint equipment. Shan had used his knife on brush and small trees, trying to put together some kind of a raft, but he had not been able to discover here any of those vines necessary for binding, and his best efforts had all come to a grief when he tried them in a lagoon launching. So far, he had achieved no form of raft which would keep him afloat longer than 5 minutes, let alone support 3 of them as far as the next island. Shan pulled listlessly at the framework of his latest try, fully disheartened. He tried not to think of the unescapable fact that the water in the rain tank had sunk to only an inch or so of muddy scum. Last night he had dug in the heart of the interior valley where the rankness of the vegetation was a promise of moisture, to uncover damp clay, and then a brackish ooze. Far too little to satisfy both him and the animals. There were surely fish somewhere in the lagoon. Shan wondered if the raw flesh of sea-dwellers could supply the water they needed. But lacking net, line, or hooks, how did one fish? Yesterday, using his stunner, he had brought down a bird, to discover the carcass so rank even the wolverines, never dainty eaters, refused to gnaw it. The animals prowled the 2 beaches, and Shan guessed they hunted shell-dwellers, for at times they dug energetically at the gravel. Togi was busied in his way now, the sand flowing from under her plumping legs, her claws raking the good earth. And it was Togi's excavation which brought Shan a first ray of hope. Her excitement was so marked that he believed she was in quest of some worthwhile game, and he moved across to inspect the pit. A patch of brown, which had been skimmed bare by one raking paw, made him shout. Will Beanie sleepy? Haggy shambled down slope, going to work beside his mate with an eagerness as open as hers. Shan hovered at the edge of the pit. They were rapidly enlarging. The brown patch was larger, disclosing itself as a hump doming up from the gravel. The Terran did not need to run his hands over that rough surface to recognize the nature of the find. This was another shell such as had come floating in after the storm to form the raw material of their canoe. However, as fast as the wolverines dug, they did not appear to make correspondingly swift headway in uncovering their find, as might reasonably be expected. In fact, a witness could guess that the shell was sinking at a pace only a fraction slower than the burrowers were using to free it. Intrigued by that, Shan went back to the waterline, secured one of the lengths he had been trying to weave into his failures, and returned to use it as a makeshift shovel. Now, with 3 of them at the digging, the brown hump was uncovered, and Shan pried down around its edge, trying to lever it up and over. To his amazement, his tool was caught and held, nearly jerked from his hands. To his retaliating tug, the obstruction below ground gave way, and the Terran sprawled back, the length of wood coming clear, to show the other end smashed and splintered as it had been caught between mashing gears. For the first time he understood that they were dealing not with an empty shell casing buried by drift under this small beach, but with a shell still inhabited by the Warlockian to whom it was a natural covering, and that inhabitant would find to continue ownership. A moment's examination of that splintered wood also suggested that the shell's present wearer appeared well able to defend itself. Sean attempted to call off the wolverines, but they were out of control now, digging frantically to get at this new prey. And he knew that if he pulled them away by force, they were apt to turn those punishing claws and snapping jaws on him. It was for their protection that he returned to digging, though he no longer tried to pry up the shell. Taggy leaped to the top of that dome, sweeping paws downward to clear its surface, while Togi prowled around its circumference, pausing now and then to send dirt and gravel splattering, but treading warily as one might alert for a sudden attack. They had the creature almost clear now, though the shell still rested firmly on the ground, and they had no notion of what it might protect. It was smaller, perhaps 2/3 the size of the one which Thorvald had fashioned into a sea-going craft, but it could provide them with transportation to the mainland if Shan was able to repeat the feat of turning it into an outrigger canoe. Taggy joined his mate on the ground, and both wolverines padded about the dome, obviously baffled. Now and then they assaulted the shell with a testing paw. Claws raked and did not leave any marks but shallow scratches. They could continue that forever, as far as Shan could see, without solving the problem in the least. He sat back on his heels and studied the scene in detail. The excavation holding the shelled creature was some 3 yards above the high water mark, with a few more feet separating that from the point where lazy waves now washed the finer sand. Shan watched the slow inward slip of those waves with growing interest. Where their combined efforts had failed to win this odd battle, perhaps the sea itself could now be pressed into service. Shan began his own excavation, a trough to lead from the waterline to the pit occupied by the obstinate shell. Of course, the thing living in or under that covering might be only too familiar with salt water, but it had placed its burrow, or hiding place, above the reach of the waves, and so might be disconcerted by the sudden appearance of water in its bed. However, the scheme was worth trying, and he went to work doggedly, wishing he could make the wolverines understand so they would help him. They still prowled about their captive, scraping at the sand about the shell casing. At least their efforts would keep the half-prisoner occupied and prevent its escape. Shan put another piece of his raft to work as a shovel, throwing up a shower of sand and gravel while sweat dampened his tattered blouse and was salt and sticky on his arms and face. He finished his trench, one which ran at an angle he hoped would feed water into the pit rapidly once he knocked away the last barrier against the waves, and, splashing out into the green water, he did just that. His calculations proved correct. Waves lapped, then flowed in a rapidly thickening stream, puddling out about the shell as the wolverines drew back, snarling. Shan lashed his knife fast to a stout length of sapling, so equipping himself with a spear. He stood with it ready in his hand, not knowing just what to expect. And when the answer to his water attack came, the move was so sudden that in spite of his preparation he was caught gaping. For the shell fairly erupted out of the mess of sand and water. A complete fringe of jointed, clawed brown limbs churned in a forward and upward dash, but the water worked to frustrate that charge. For one of the pitfalls crumbled, overbalancing the creature so that the fore end of the shell lifted from the ground, the legs clawing wildly at the air. Shan thrust with the spear, feeling the knife point go home so deeply that he could not pull his improvised weapon free. A limb snapped claws, only inches away from his legs, as he pushed down on the haft with his strength. That attack, along with the initial upset of balance, did the job. The shell flopped over, its rounded hump now embedded in the watery sand of the pit where the frantic struggles of the creature to right itself only buried it the deeper. The Terran stared down upon the segmented underbelly, where legs were paired in rib-like formation. Shan could locate no head, no good target. But he drew his stunner and beamed at either end of the oval, and then, for good measure, in the middle, hoping in one of those 3 general blasts to contact the thing's central nervous system. He was not to know which of those shots did the trick, but the frantic wiggling of the legs slowed and finally ended, as a clockwork toy might run down for want of winding, and at last projected, at crooked angles, completely still. The shell creature might not be dead, but it was tamed for now. Taggy had only been waiting for a good chance to do battle. He grabbed one of those legs, worried it, and then leaped to tear at the underbody. Unlike the outer shell, this portion of the creature had no proper armor, and the wolverine plunged joyfully into the business of the kill, his mate following suit. Noodles. The process of butchery was a bloody, even beastly job, and Shan was shaken before it was complete. But he kept at his labors, determined to have that shell, his one chance of escape from the island. The wolverines feasted on the greenish-white flesh, but he could not bring himself to sample it, climbing to the heights in search of eggs, and making a happy find of a niche filled with the edible moss fungi. By late afternoon, he had the shell scooped fairly clean, and the wolverines had carried away for burial such portions as they had not been able to consume at their first eating. Meanwhile, the leather-headed birds had grown bold enough to snatch up the fragments he tossed out on the water, struggling for that bounty against feeders arising from the depths of the lagoon. At the coming of dusk, Shan hauled the blood-stained grizzly trophy well up the beach and wedged it among the rocks, determined not to lose his treasure. Then he stripped and washed, first his clothing and then himself, rubbing his hands and arms with sand until his skin was tender, and he was still exultant at his luck. The drift would supply him with materials for an outrigger. 1 more day's work, or maybe 2. And he could leave. He wrung out his blouse and gazed toward the distant line of the shore. Once he had his new canoe ready, he would try to make the trip back in the early morning while the mists were still on the sea. That should give him cover against any Throg flight. That night, Shan slept in the deep fog of bodily exhaustion. There were no dreams, nothing but an unconsciousness which even a Throg attack could not have pierced. He roused in the morning with an odd feeling of guilt. The waterhole he had scooped in the valley yielded him some swallows tasting of earth, but he had almost forgotten the flavor of a purer liquid. Munching on a fistful of moss, he hurried down to the shore, half fearing to find the shell gone, his luck out once again. Not only was the shell where he had wedged it, but he had done better than he knew when he had left it exposed in the night. Small things scuttled away from it into hiding, and several birds arose. Scavengers had been busy lightening his unwelcome task for that morning, and seeing how the cleanup process had gone, Shan had a second inspiration. You blame Echo. We can blame Echo. That's fine. Pushing the thing down the beach, he sank it in the shallows, with several rocks to anchor it. Within a few seconds, the shell was invaded by a whole school of spiny-tailed fish that ate greedily, leaving his find to their cleaning. Shan went back to prospect the pile of raft material, choosing pieces which could serve for an outrigger frame. He was handicapped, as he had been all along, by the absence of the vines one could use for lashings, and he had reached the point of considering a drastic sacrifice of his clothing to get the necessary strips when he saw Taggy dragging behind him one of the jointed legs the wolverines had put in storage the day before. Now and again, Taggy laid his prize on the shingle, holding it firmly pinned with his forepaws as he tried to worry loose a section of flesh. But apparently that feat was beyond even his notable teeth, and at length he left it lying there in disgust while he returned to a cache for more palatable fare. Shan went to examine more closely the triple-jointed limb. The casing was not as hard as horn or shell, he discovered upon testing. It more resembled tough skin laid over bone. With a knife he tried to loosen the skin, a tedious job requiring a great deal of patience, since the tissue tore if pulled away too fast. But with care he acquired a few thongs, perhaps a foot long. Using 2 of these, he made a trial binding of one stick to another, and experimented farther, soaking the whole construction in seawater, and then exposing it to the direct rays of the sun. When he examined his test piece an hour later, the skin thongs had set into place with such success that the one piece of wood might have been firmly glued to the other. Shan shuffled his feet in a little dance of triumph as he went on to the lagoon to inspect the waterlogged shell. The scavengers had done well. 1 scraping, 2 at the most, would have the whole thing clean and ready to use. But that night, Shan dreamed. No climbing of a skull-shaped mountain this time. Instead, he was again on the beach, laboring under an overwhelming compulsion, building something for an alien purpose he could not understand. And he worked as hopelessly as a beaten slave, knowing that what he made was to be his undoing. Yet he could not halt the making, because just beyond the limit of his vision there stood a dominant will which held him in bondage. And he awoke on the beach in the very early dawn, not knowing how he had come there. His body was bathed in sweat, as it had been during his day's labors under the sun, and his muscles ached with fatigue. But when he saw what lay at his feet, he cringed. The framework of the outrider, close to completion the night before, was dismantled, smashed. All those strips of hide he had so laboriously culled were cut into inch-long bits which could be of no service. Shan whirled, ran to the shell he had night before pulled from the water and stowed in safety. Its rounded dome was dulled where it had been battered, but there was no break in the surface. He ran his hands anxiously over the curve to make sure. Then, very slowly, he came back to the mess of broken wood and snipped hide. And he was sure, only too sure, of one thing. He himself had wrought that destruction. In his dream he had built to satisfy the whim of an enemy, In reality, he had destroyed. And that was also, he believed, to satisfy an enemy. The dream was a part of it, but who or what could set a man dreaming and so take over his body, make him in fact betray himself? But then, what had made Thorvald maroon him there? For the first time, Shan guessed a new, if wild, explanation for the officer's desertion. Dreams. And the disc which had worked so strangely on Thorvald. Suppose everything the other had surmised was the truth. Then that disc had been found on this very island, and here somewhere must lie a clue to the riddle. Shan licked his lips. Suppose that Thorvald had been sent away under such a strong compulsion as the one which had ruled Shan last night. Why was he left behind if the other had been moved away to protect some secret? Was it that Shan himself was wanted here? Wanted so much that when he at last found a means of escape, he was set to destroy it? That act might have been forced upon him for two reasons: to keep him here, and to impress upon him how powerless he was. Powerless. Armed, he could prepare to fight back. He squatted by the wreckage as he thought that through, turning over broken pieces. And Shan realized, he must present at the moment a satisfactory picture of despondency to any spy. A spy. That was it. Someone or something must have him under observation, or his activities of the day before would not have been so summarily countered. Excuse me. And if there was a spy, then there was his answer to the riddle: to trap the trapper. Such action might be a project beyond his resources, but it was his own counterattack. So now he had to play a role. Not only must he search the island for the trace of his spy, but he must do it in a fashion that his purpose would not be plain to the enemy he suspected. The Wolverines could help. Shan arose, allowed his shoulders to droop, slouching to the slope with all the air of a beaten man which he could assume, whistling for Taggy and Toki. When they came, his exploration began. Ostensibly, he was hunting for lengths of drift or suitable growing saplings to take the place of those he had destroyed under orders, but he kept a careful watch on the animal pair, hoping by their reactions to pick up a clue to any hidden watcher. The larger of the two beaches marked the point where the Terrans had first landed, and where the shell thing had been killed. The smaller was more of a narrow tongue thrust out into the lagoon, much of it choked with sizable boulders. On earlier visits, there Taggy and Togi had poked into the hollows among these with their usual curiosity, but now both animals remained upslope, showing no inclination to descend to the waterline. Shan caught hold of Taggy's scruff, pulling him along. The wolverine twisted and whined, but he did not fight for freedom as he would have upon scenting Throg. Not that the Terran had ever believed one of those aliens was responsible for the happenings on the island. Taggy came down under Shan's urging, but he was plainly ill at ease, and at last he snarled a warning when the man would have drawn him closer to two rocks which met overhead in a crude semblance of an arch. There was a stick of drift protruding from that hollow, affording Shan a legitimate excuse to venture closer. He dropped his hold on the wolverines, stooped to gather in the length of wood, and at the same time glanced into the pocket. Water lay just beyond, making this a doorway to the lagoon. The sun had not yet penetrated into the shadow, if it ever did. Shan reached for the wood, at the same time drawing his finger across the flat rock, which would furnish a stepping stone for anything using that door as an entrance to the island. Wet. Which might mean his visitor had recently arrived, or else merely that a splotch of spray had landed there not too long before. But in his mind, Shan was convinced that he had found the spy's entrance. Could he turn it into a trap? He added a piece of drift to his bundle and picked up 2 more before he returned to the cliff ahead. A trap. He revolved in his mind all the traps he knew which could be used here. He already had decided upon the bait, his own work. And if his plans went through, and hope does not die easily, then this time he would not waste his labor either. So he went back to the same job he had done the day before, making do with skin strips he had considered second best before, smoothing, cutting. Only the trap contained his mind, and close to sunset he knew just what he was going to do and how. Though the Terran did not know the nature of the unseen opponent, he thought he could guess 2 weaknesses which might deliver the other into his hands. First, the enemy was entirely confident of success in this venture. No being who is able to control Shan as completely and ably as had been done the night before would credit any prey with the power to strike back in force. Second, such a confident enemy would be unable to resist watching the manipulation of a captive. The Terran was certain that his opponent would be on the scene somewhere when he was led, dreaming to destroy his work once more. He might be wrong on both those accounts, but inwardly he didn't believe so. However, he had to wait until the dark to set up his own answer, one so simple he was certain the enemy would not suspect it at all. End of chapter 10. Interesting. So these dreams, I'm interested in these dreams. And at first I was thinking, well, maybe like Thorvald left because of the disc, like that's what was leading him. But then he had the dream. Then Shan had the dream, and they both had dreams earlier. So Shan's dream about the mountain shaped like the skull, and Thorvald's dream about the green veiled cavern. So it's interesting that they can do stuff during the dream now. Instead of just like power of suggestion, it is like morphed into like, okay, you think that you're building something in this dream, but really you're destroying your way off of this island. And I think that's super interesting. All right, we have time for one last chapter today. Let's do it. Chapter 11. We are 51% of the way through. Halfway through. We did it. Chapter 11. The Witch. There were patches of light in the inner valley marking the phosphorescent plants, some creeping at ground level, others tall as saplings. On other nights, Shan had welcomed that wan radiance, but now he lay in as relaxed a position as possible, marking each of those potential betrayers as he tried to counterfeit the attitude of sleep, and at the same time plan out his route. He had purposely settled in a pool of shadow, the wolverines beside him, and he thought that the bulk of the animals' bodies would cover his own withdrawal when the time came to move. One arm lying limply across his middle was in reality clutching to him an intricate arrangement of small hide straps, which he had made by sacrificing most of the remainder of his painfully acquired thongs. The trap must be set in place soon. Now that he had charted a path to the crucial point avoiding all light plants, Shan was ready to move. The Terran pressed his hand on Taggy's head in the one imperative command the Wolverine was apt to obey, the order to stay where he was. Shan sat up and gave the same voiceless instruction to Togi. Then he inched out of the hollow, a worm's progress to that narrow way along the cliff top, the path which anyone or anything coming up from that sea gate on the beach would have to pass in order to witness the shoreline occupied by the half-built outrigger. So much of his plan was based upon luck and guesses, but those were all Shan had. And as he worked at the stretching of his snare, the Terran's heart pounded, and he tensed at every sound out of the night. Having tested all the anchoring of his net, he tugged at a last knot, and then crouched to listen not only with his ears, but with all his strength of mind and body. Pound of waves, whistle of wind, the sleepy complaint of some bird, a regular splashing, one of the fish in the lagoon, or what he awaited. The Terran retreated as noiselessly as he had come, heading for the hollow where he had bedded down. He reached there, breathless, his heart pumping, his mouth dry as if he had been racing. Taggy stirred and thrust a nose inquiringly against Shan's arm. But the wolverine made no sound, as if he, too, realized that some menace lay beyond the rim of the valley. Would that other come up the path Shan had trapped? Or had he been wrong? Was the enemy already stalking him from the other beach? The grip of his stunner was slippery in his damp hand. He hated this waiting. The canoe. His work on it had been a careless botching. Better to have the job done right. Why? It was perfectly clear now how he had been mistaken. His whole work plan was wrong. He could see the right way of doing things laid out as clear as a blueprint in his mind. A picture in his mind. Shan stood up, and both wolverines moved uneasily, though neither made a sound. A picture in his mind. But this time he wasn't asleep. He wasn't dreaming a dream, to be used for his own defeat. Only, that other could not know this. The pressure which had planted the idea of new work to be done in his mind, an idea one part of him accepted as fact, had not taken warning from his move. He was supposed to be under control. The Terran was sure of that. All right. So he would play the part. He must, if he would entice the trapper into his trap. He holstered his stunner, walked out into the open, paying no heed now to the patches of light through which he must pass on his way to the path his own feet had already worn to the boat beach. As he went, Shan tried to counterfeit what he believed would be the gait of a man under compulsion. Now he was on the rim, fronting the downslope, fighting against his desire to turn and see for himself if anything had climbed behind him. The canoe was all wrong. A bad job which he must make better at once so that in the morning he would be free of this island prison. The pressure of that other's will grew stronger, and the Terran read into that overconfidence which he believed would be part of the enemy's character. The one who was sending him to destroy his own work had no suspicion that the victim was not entirely malleable, ready to be used as he himself would use a knife or a force axe. Shan strode steadily downslope. With a small spurt of fear, he knew that in the way that unseen other was right. The pressure was taking over, even though he was awake this time. The Terran tried to will his hand to his stunner, but his fingers fell, instead, on the hilt of his knife. He drew the blade as panic seethed in his head, chilling him from within. He had underestimated the other's power, and that panic flared into open fight, making him forget his careful plans. Now he must wrench free from this control. The knife was moving to slash a hide lashing, directed by his hand, but not his will. A soundless gasp, a flash of dismay rocked him, but neither was his gasp nor his dismay. That pressure snapped off. He was free. But the other wasn't. Knife still in fist, Shan turned and ran upslope, his torch in his other hand. He could see a shape now writhing, fighting, outlined against a light bush. And, fearing that the stranger might win free and disappear, the Terran spotlighted the captive in the beam, reckless of Throg or enemy reinforcements. The other crouched, plainly startled by the sudden burst of light. Shan stopped abruptly. He had not really built up any mental picture of what he had expected to find in his snare, but this prisoner was as weirdly alien to him as a Throg. The light on the torch was reflected off a skin which glittered as if scaled, glittered with the brilliance of jewels in bands and coils of color spreading from the throat down the chest, spiraling up around upper arms, around waist and thighs, as if the stranger were a treasure house of gems as part of a living body. Except for those patterned loops, coils, and bands, the body had no clothing, though a belt about the slender middle supported a pair of pouches and some odd implements held in loops. Hey, Mackle. Welcome in. Hello, hi. Roughly, the figure was more humanoid than the Throg's. The upper limbs were not too unlike Shan's arms, though the hands had 4 digits of equal length instead of 5. But the creatures were non-human, closer to saurian in contour. It had large eyes, blazing yellow in the dazzle of the flash, with vertical slits of green for pupils. A nose united with the jaw to make a snout, and above the domed forehead a sharp V point of raised, spiky growth extended back and down until behind the shoulder blades it widened and expanded to resemble a pair of wings. The captive no longer struggled, but sat quietly in the tangle of the snare Shan had set, watching the Terran steadily, as if there were no difficulty in seeing through the brilliance of the beam to the man who held it, and, oddly enough, Shan experienced no repulsion towards its reptilian appearance as he had upon first sighting the beetle Throg. On impulse, he put down his torch on the rock and walked into the light to face squarely the thing out of sea. Xavier, go to sleep. Thank you so much for the follow. Hello, hi, welcome in. Mako, thank you for contributing to Sunday's stream. Bup. Too excited. Lost my spot. So we're just gonna start here. Oh, thank you so much. Hi. The captive no longer struggled, but sat quietly in the tangle of the snares Shan had set, watching the Terran steadily as if there were no difficulty in seeing through the brilliance of the beam to the man who held it. And, oddly enough, Shan experienced no repulsion towards its reptilian appearances as he had upon first sighting the beetle Throg. On impulse, he put down his torch on a rock and walked into the light to face squarely the thing out of the sea. Still eyeing Shan, the captive raised one limb and gave an absent-minded tug to the belt it wore. Shan, noting that gesture, was struck by a wild surmise, leading him to study the prisoner more narrowly. Allowing for the alien structure of bone, the non-human skin, this creature was delicate, graceful, in its way beautiful, with a fragility of limb which backed up his suspicions, moved by no pressure from the other, but by his own will and sense of fitness. Shan stooped to cut the control line of his snare. The captive continued to watch as Shan sheathed his blade and then held out his hand. Yellow eyes, never blinking since his initial appearance, regarded him, not with any trace of fear or dismay, but with the calm measurement, which was curiosity based upon a strong belief in its own superiority. He did not know how he knew, but Shan was certain that the creature out of the sea was still entirely confident, that it made no fight because it did not conceive of any possible danger from him. And again, oddly enough, he was not irritated by this unconscious arrogance. Rather, he was intrigued and amused. Friends? Shan used the basic galactic speech devised by Survey and the Free Traders, semantics which depended upon the proper inflection of voice and tone to project meaning when the words were foreign. The other made no sound. and the Terran began to wonder if this captive had any audible form of speech. He withdrew a step or two, then pulled at the snare, drawing the cords away from the creature's slender ankles. Rolling the thongs into a ball, he tossed the crude net back over his shoulder. "Friends?" he repeated again, showing his empty hands, trying to give that one word the appropriate inflection, hoping the other could read his peaceful intent in his features, if not by his speech. In one lithe, flowing movement, the alien arose. Fully, the Warlockian had a frail appearance. Shan, for his breed, was not tall, but the native was still smaller, not more than 5 feet, that stiff V of head crest just topping Shan's shoulder. Whether any of those fittings at its belt could be a weapon, the Terran had no way of telling. However, the other made no move to draw any of them. Instead, one of the 4-digit hands came up. Shan felt the feather touch the strange fingertips on his chin, across his lips, up his cheek, to at last press firmly on his forehead at a spot just below the eyebrows. What followed was communication of a sort, not in words or in any describable flow of thoughts. There was no feeling of enmity, at least nothing strong enough to be called that. Curiosity, yes, and then a growing doubt, not of the Terran himself, but of the other's preconceived ideas concerning him. Shan was other than the native had judged him, and the stranger was disturbed, that self-confidence a little ruffled. And also, Shan was right in his guess. He smiled, his amusement growing, not aimed at his companion on this cliff top, but at himself. For he was dealing with a woman, a very young woman, and someone as fully feminine in her way as any human girl could be. "Friends?" he asked for the 3rd time. But the other still exuded a wariness mixed with surprise, and the tenuous message which passed between them then astounded Shan. To this Warlockian out of the night, he was not following the proper pattern of male behavior at all. He should have been in awe of the other merely because of her sex. A diffidence rather than an assumption of equality should have colored his response, judged by her standards. At first, he caught a flash of anger at this preposterous attitude of his, then her curiosity won. But there was still no reply to his question. The fingertips no longer made contact between them. Stepping back, her hands now reached for one of the pouches at her belt. Shan watched that movement carefully, and because he did not trust her too far, he whistled. Her head came up. She might be dumb, but plainly she was not deaf. And she gazed down into the hollow as the wolverines answered his summons with growls. Her profile reminded Shan of something for an instant, but it should have been golden yellow instead of silver with 2 jeweled patterns ringing the snout. Yes, that small plaque he had seen in the cabin of one of the ship's officers, a very old Terran legend. Dragon, the officer had named the creature. Only that one had possessed a serpent's body, a lizard's legs and wings. Shan gave a sudden start, aware his thoughts had made him careless, or had she in some way led him into that bypath of memory for her own purposes, because now she held some object in the curve of her curled fingers, regarding him with those unblinking yellow eyes. 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 Shan dimly heard the alarm cry of the wolverines. He tried to snap-draw his stunner, but it was too late. There was a haze about him hiding the rocks. The island valley with its radiant plants, the night sky, the bright beam of the torch. Now he moved that haze as one walks through a dream-approaching nightmare, striding with an effort as if wading through a deterring flood. Sound, sight, one after another, those senses were taken from him. Desperately, Shan held to one thing, his own sense of identity. He was Shan Lanty, Terran breed, out of tier, of the survey service. Some part of him repeated those facts with vast urgency against an almost overwhelming force which strove to defeat that awareness of self, making him nothing but a tool, or a weapon, for another's use. The Terran fought, soundlessly but fiercely, on a battleground which was within him, knowing in a detached way that his body obeyed another commands. "I am Shan," he cried without audible speech. "I am myself. I have 2 hands, 2 legs. I think for myself. I am a man." And to that came an answer of sorts, a blow of will's striking at his resistance, a will which struggled to drown him before ebbing, leaving behind in a faint suggestion of bewilderment, of a dawn of concern. "I am a man." He hurled that assertion as he might have thrust deep with one of the crude spears he had used against the Throgs. For against what he faced now, his weapons were as crude as spears fronting blasters. "I am Shan Lanty, Terran, man." Those were facts. No haze could sweep them from his mind or take away that heritage. And again, there was the lightening of the pressure, the slight recoil, which could only be a prelude to another assault upon his last stronghold. He clutched his 3 facts to him as a shield, groping for others which might have afforded a weapon of rebuttal. Dreams. These Warlockians dealt in and through dreams, and the opposite of dreams are facts. His name, his breed, his sex, these were facts. And Warlock itself was a fact. The earth under his boots was a fact. The water which washed around the island was a fact. The air he breathed was a fact. Flesh, blood, bones, facts, all of them. Now he was a struggling identity imprisoned in a rebel body. But that body was real. He tried to feel it. Blood pumped from his heart. His lungs filled and emptied. He struggled to feel those processes. With a terrifying shock, the envelope which had held him vanished. Shan was choking, struggling in water. He flailed out with his arms, kicked his legs. One hand grated painfully against stone, hardly knowing what he did, but fighting for his life. Shan caught at that rock and drew his head out of water, coughing and gasping, half drowned. He was weak with the panic of his close brush with death. The chapter is getting into some identity stuff that did not age well. Yes. He's defeating her womanly wiles with man logic. For a long moment, he could only cling to the rock which had saved him, retching and dazed, as the water washed about his body, a current tugging at his trailing legs. There was light of a sort here, patches of green which glowed with the same subdued light as the bushes of the outer world, for he was no longer under the night sky. A rock roof was but inches over his head. He must be in some cave or tunnel under the surface of the sea. Again, a gust of panic shook him as he felt trapped. The water continued to pull at Shan, and in his weakened condition it was a temptation to yield to that pull. The more he fought it, the more he was exhausted. At last, the Terran turned on his back, trying to float with the stream, sure he could no longer battle it. Luckily, those few inches of space above the surface of the water continued, and he had air to breathe. But the fear of that ending, of being swept under the surface, chewed at his nerves, and his bodily danger burned away the last of the spell which had held him, brought him into this place, wherever it might be. But it was only his heightened imagination, or had the current grown swifter? Shan tried to gauge the speed of his passage by the way the patches of green light slipped by. Now he turned and began to swim slowly, feeling as if his arms were laden weights, his ribs a cage to bind his aching lungs. Another patch of light, larger, spreading across the roof overhead. Then he was out of the tunnel into a cavern so vast that its arching roof was like a sky dome far above his head. But here the patches of light were brighter, and they were arranged in odd groups which had a familiar look to them. Only, better than freedom overhead, there was a shore not too distant. Shan swam for that haven, summoning up the last rags of his strength, knowing that if he could not reach it very soon he was finished. Somehow he made it and lay gasping, his cheek resting on sand finer than any of the outer world, his fingers digging into it for purchase to drag his body on. But when he collapsed, his legs were still awash in water. No footfall could be heard on that sand, but he knew that he was no longer alone. He braced his hands and with painful effort levered him up his body. Somehow he made it to his knees, but he could not stand. Instead, he half tumbled back, so that he faced them from a sitting position. Them. There were 3 of them, the dragon-headed ones with their slender, jewel-set bodies glittering even in this subdued light, their yellow eyes fastened on him with a remoteness which did not approach any human emotion, save perhaps that of a cold and limited wonder. But beyond them came a 4th, one he knew by the patterns of her body. Shan clasped his hands about his knees to still the trembling of his body, and eyed them back with all the defiance he could muster. Nor did he doubt that he had been brought here, his body as captive to their will, as he had been that of their spy or messenger in his crude snare on the island. "Well, you have me," he said hoarsely. "Now what?" His words boomed weirdly out over the water, or echoed from the dim outer reaches of the cavern. There was no answer. They merely stood watching him. Shan stiffened, determined to hold to his defiance and to that identity which he now knew was his weapon against the powers they used. The one who had somehow drawn him there moved at last, circling around the other 3 with a suggestion of diffidence in her manner. Shan jerked back his head as her hand stretched to touch his face. And then, guessing that she sought her peculiar form of communication, he submitted to her fingertips, though now his skin crawled under that light but firm pressure and he shrank from the contract. There were no sensations this time. To his amazement, a concrete inquiry shaped itself in his brain, as clear as if the question had been spoken aloud. "Who are you?" "Shan," he began vocally, and then turned words into thoughts. "Shan Lanty, Terran, man." He made his answer the same which had kept him from succumbing to their complete domination. "Name, Shan Lanty, man. Yes." The other accepted those. "Terran." That was a question. Did these people have any notion of space travel? Could they understand the concept of another world holding intelligent beings? "I come from another world." He tried to make a clean-cut picture in his mind. A globe in space. A ship blasting free. "Look!" The fingers still rested between his eyebrows, but with her other hand the Warlockian was pointing up to the dome of the cavern. Shan followed her order. He studied those patches of light which had seemed so vaguely familiar at his first sighting, studying them closely to know them for what they were. A star map. A map of the heavens as they could be seen from the outer crust of Warlock. "Yes, I come from the stars," he answered, booming with his voice. The fingers dropped from his forehead. The scaled head swung round in exchange glances, which were perhaps some unheard communication with the other 3. Then the hand was extended again. "Come." Fingers fell from his head to his right wrist, closing there with surprising strength, and some of that strength together with a new energy flowed from them into him, so that he found and kept his feet as the other drew up. End of chapter 11. All right. We got some alien space babes. It was it was probably bound to happen. I should have known that was coming. That is a very common uh sci-fi pulp trope. Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. And it's so interesting that it's written this way because Andre's a lady. There they are, Captain Hardship. You knew it would happen. You said this last time. Hello. Hi. Yeah, they're here. Dragon space babes. Is it possibly a case of overcompensating? That could be. That could be. I mean, if you think about it, if she wrote more from like a woman's perspective as a woman author, it probably wouldn't have been picked up, or people would be like, "You're not a dude, I'm not gonna read this." So yeah, she's might be like trying to fall into that so that it is picked up and so that it is seen as like a legit science fiction book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can see that. I can see that happening. Yeah, mimicking what she's read in other sci-fi, that could totally be too. Absolutely. Especially if science fiction like wasn't her jam. She probably read a lot and was like, "Ah, space babes. Got to include that." For sure. Sci-fi in the late 50s. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a little cringy, but and campy at the same time. But again, like the main story, which now that it's been revealed that the natives are like dragony space babes, I'm wondering if the like rest of the story is going to still be interesting or if it's going to sort of devolve into like some cop out stuff that I'm not excited for. All they need is a boxy robot with dryer hose arms to make it true 50s feeling. Dragony space babes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm hoping that the rest of like the actual story is still exciting, but I mean, I don't know. We'll see. And like if they're communicating to them through their dreams or like through their subconscious, then I'm wondering like what their end game is. Like why send Thorvald away and why send these like very specific dreams different to Shan and to Thorvald. It's interesting. It's interesting. Oh, absolutely. You should always brace yourself when reading something older. You never know quite what to expect. But yeah, you're right. We should absolutely be bracing ourselves. Obviously, Thorvald is not hot enough. He needed to leave immediately. Get him off this island. That's truly what it was. Go send him on some mission that he thinks is important. Telepathic alien space babes. Still better than Weems. That's gonna be like the new bar for like any book. Like, still better than Weems or ooh. Weems might be better than this. But yeah, that's going to be it for tonight. Let's see. We left off on chapter 12. Let's see how far we are. 56%. Amazing. On a scale of Mr. Rogers to Weems. I love that measurement. But yeah, can you write an antagonist better or worse than Weems? That is the thing. Weems was a terrible character, but was so well written. Yes, you're right. He was terrible in the way he was supposed to be terrible, rather than terrible in the, ooh, this did not like age well. We're supposed to like him terrible. For sure, for sure. Oh, Lil Bean sleeping. All right. Well, I'm hungry. So that's going to be it for tonight. I will be back on continuing right where we left off on